Logic and Existence by Jean Hyppolite. Alright. Translator's preface. Originally published in France in 1952, Logic et Existence illuminates what Hyppolite himself calls Hegelianism's most obscure dialectical synthesis, the relation between the phenomenology and the logic. As he says, how does the passage from the phenomenology to absolute knowledge work? This question is the Hegelian question par excellence, and the very purpose of this work lies in the attempt to pose this question by confronting Hegel's diverse attitudes concerning it. Hegel solves this almost insoluble problem by means of a notion of correspondence. And correspondence means, according to Hyppolite, that the phenomenology and the logic mutually presuppose one another. Hyppolite says experience and the logos are not opposed. The discourse of experience and the discourse of being, the a posteriori and the a priori, correspond to one another and mutually require one another. There would be no possible experience without the presupposition of absolute knowledge, but the path of experience points ahead to absolute knowledge. The logic presupposes the phenomenology insofar as it is only across a history of humanity that the logos appears, and the phenomenology presupposes the logic insofar as it is only the concept that explains or supports experience. Mutual correspondence, therefore, implies for Hyppolite that man is the house of the universal, of the logos, of being. But mutual correspondence does not imply that man is equivalent to universal self-consciousness in Hegel. Experience cannot be reduced to the concept, and the concept cannot be reduced to experience. Hyppolite's non-reductionist interpretation of the relation between the phenomenology and the logic effectively ended the simple anthropological interpretation of Hegel popularized by Kojève before World War II. Because of Hyppolite, no reading of Hegel would be able to push man up to the immodest position of being the absolute, the end of history, the source of nothingness. Like Husserl's transcendental reduction, speculative thought, according to Hyppolite, will be a reduction of the human condition. The logic's dialectical discourse will be the very discourse of being, the phenomenology, having shown the possibility of bracketing man as natural design. Hyppolite's interpretation of the relation therefore fueled the fire of French anti-humanism, which Heidegger's letter on humanism had already ignited. In short, Logic and Existence opened the way for the theme that would dominate French thought after Sartre's Being and Nothingness. The concept of difference, found in the philosophies of Deleuze, Derrida, and Foucault, would not exist without the publication of Logic and Existence. Correspondence implies not only that the phenomenology and the logic mutually presuppose one another, but also that there is a difference between them. Hyppolite recognizes the similarity of Nietzsche's thought to that of Hegel. The proclamation that God is dead means that there is no second intelligible world behind the first phenomenal world. There is no transcendent beyond. As Hyppolite says, Hegelian logic recognizes neither the thing in itself nor the intelligible world. The absolute is not thought anywhere else than in the phenomenal world. Absolute thought thinks itself in our thought. In our thought, being presents itself as thought and as sense, and Hegel's dialectical logic, like the logic of philosophy, is the expression of this doctrine of complete immanence. Although it completes immanence, Hegel's speculative logic maintains the distinction between essence and appearance. Rather than being one of externality, one thing next to and outside of another, this distinction is one of internality. Internal or essential difference is the production of a double which is not an ontic double, which is not another thing. Internal difference, then, is being's own self-difference. Being differentiates itself by twisting itself, by folding itself over, by reflecting itself in order to think itself, according to Hyppolite. Being becomes its own other. It becomes both subject and object. It contradicts itself. The nature of Hegelian self-contradiction can be seen clearly in two ways, in the passage from the finite to the infinite and in the dialectic of diversity. If we conceive the difference between the finite and the infinite as external, this would amount to placing the finite on one side and the infinite on the other. The finite and the infinite would be like two things set side by side. The result of this side-by-side position would be that the infinite itself would be limited and would no longer be infinite. Having the finite as its boundary, the infinite would, in fact, be finite. Therefore, in order for the infinite to be truly infinite, it is necessary to make the finite internal to the infinite. Likewise, in order for the finite to be truly finite, it must contain the infinite within itself. Without the infinite as its limit, the finite would be everywhere. It would be infinite. As Hyppolite says, what is at issue is not to put on one side unity, infinity, universality, and on the other, multiplicity, the finite, the particular. But in order to do that, we have to twist thought, we have to force it to look contradiction square in the face and to turn it into a means of surmounting the differences onto which the understanding holds. The infinite is not beyond the finite, because then it itself would be finite. It would have the finite outside of itself as its limit. Similarly, the finite negates itself. It becomes its other. In other words, both the infinite and the finite must contradict themselves and contain their others within themselves. Similarly, in the dialectic of diversity, Hegel finds negation. A thing that is big in relation to one thing is small in relation to another. Each thing is what it is and is not what it is not. In The Sophist, Plato had tried to transform this negation into alterity. Thereby, he sought to avoid contradiction. In contrast, according to Hyppolite, Hegelian dialectic will push this alterity up to contradiction. Negation belongs to things and to distinct determinations insofar as they are distinct, but that means that their apparent positivity turns out to be a real negativity. This negativity will condense the opposition in negation. Negation will be the vital force of the dialectic of the real as well as that of logical dialectic. For Hippolyte's Hegel, opposition is inevitable, not because there is only a multiplicity of things, of finite modes, or of monads, but because each is in relation with the others, or rather with all the others, so that its distinction is its distinction from all the rest. The complete distinction of a thing reconnects it to the whole universe, that reduces differences to essential and internal difference. The difference between a thing or a determination and its other. This duality is the speculative duality, the fundamental double. Determining a thing's difference from all the rest implies that the thing's most basic quality is discovered. In other words, opposition is inevitable because all quantitative differences are turned into qualitative differences. The advantage of qualities for Hegel is that they cannot be defined in isolation from one another. Each quality makes an internal reference to its opposite. This internal reference contradiction allows Hegel to infinitize or totalize being. It is precisely this drive to totalization, this pushing of difference up to contradiction, that Derrida and Deleuze reject. In fact, according to Deleuze, Hyppolite's emphasis of Hegel's drive to contradiction ultimately justifies the humanistic reading of Hegel. Nevertheless, due to Hyppolite, both Deleuze and Derrida recognize the importance of Hegel's transformation of difference into essential difference. For instance, there would be no notion of contaminating difference without Hippolyte's analysis of essential difference in logic and existence. In a note to his 1964 Violence and Metaphysics, Derrida says that pure difference is not absolutely different from non-difference. Hegel's critique of the concept of pure difference is for us here doubtless the most uncircumventable theme. Hegel thought absolute difference and showed that it can be pure only by being impure. End quote. He also says, however, in the 1972 collection of interviews positions, I have attempted to distinguish différance from Hegelian difference, and have done so precisely at the point at which Hegel, in the greater logic, determines difference as contradiction only in order to resolve it, to interiorize it, to lift it up into the self-presence of an onto-theological or onto-teleological synthesis. Similarly, for Deleuze, the project of a philosophy of difference lies in formulating the notion of an internal but non-conceptual difference. This new notion of difference must, for Deleuze, be non-conceptual because it is in relation to the form of identity in the generic concept that difference goes as far as opposition, that it is pushed as far as contrariety. That's from Difference and Repetition. As Deleuze says, our claim is not only that difference in itself is not already contradiction, but that it cannot be reduced or traced back to contradiction, since the latter is not more but less profound than difference. Thus, for Derrida and Deleuze, if one wants to construct a genuine, that is, non-humanistic notion of difference, contradiction must be pushed back down to diversity, back down to alterity. Since Hyppolite defines the Hegelian concept as sense, the problem of the other in Hegel, which is still that of difference, is the problem of nonsense. Clearly, the phrase sense and nonsense refers to Merleau-Ponty. In the phenomenology of perception, Merleau-Ponty had already exploited the ambiguity of the word sense. Following Hegel, Hyppolite continuously makes use of the ambiguity found in the word sense. Nonsense, or experience, is sense insofar as sense is understood as what is received through the senses, understood as what is directed towards, as what is not yet meaning. As intuition, sense is the concept in itself. It is pre-expressive, but not non-expressive. As Hyppolite says, one does not go from a silent intuition to an expression, from an inexpressible to an expressed, any more than from nonsense to sense. The progress of thought, its development, is the very progress of expression. For Hyppolite, thought never goes from nonsense to sense, but only from sense to sense, from expression to expression, from determination to determination. As he says, quote, here perhaps we get to the decisive point of Hegelianism, to this torsion of thought, through which we are able to think conceptually the unthinkable, to what makes Hegel simultaneously the greatest irrationalist and the greatest rationalist who has existed. We cannot emerge from the logos, but the logos emerges from itself by remaining itself. Since it is the indivisible self, the absolute, it thinks the non-thought. It thinks sense in its relation to nonsense, to the opaque being of nature. It reflects this opacity into its contradiction. It raises thought, which would be only thought, over itself by obliging it to contradict itself. It turns its contradiction into the speculative means by which to reflect the absolute itself. One cannot underestimate the importance of this comment. Hyppolite shows here that in Hegel, the non-thought of thought, thought's double, non-philosophy or the anti-logos, are nothing but the logos emerging from itself in continuity with itself by means of self-contradiction. The other, nature for example, is always the other of the logos, its other. For Hyppolite's Hegel, there is only sense. Hyppolite therefore calls Hegel's logic a logic of sense. In 1969, Deleuze adopts this phrase from Hyppolite's Logic and Existence as the title of one of his own books. Echoing Hyppolite, Deleuze says the logic of sense is necessarily determined to posit, between sense and nonsense, an original type of intrinsic relation, a mode of co-presence. But the intrinsic relation that Deleuze will formulate will not be based in contradiction. More importantly, for Deleuze, nonsense enacts a donation of sense, such that sense is always an effect, always an event. Thus, Deleuze's book should really be called The Logic of Nonsense, because in Deleuze's logic, it is not the case that sense differentiates itself into its other, into nonsense, as in Hegel's Logic of Sense. Rather, in Deleuze's logic, sense is differentiated by nonsense. This reversal of priority is why Deleuze specifies the definition of nonsense so precisely. He says, quote, "Nonsense does not have any particular sense, but is opposed to the absence of sense rather than to the sense that it produces in excess. Nonsense is that which has no sense, and that which, as such, and as it enacts the donation of sense, is opposed to the absence of sense. This is what we must understand by nonsense," end quote. This discussion of nonsense by Deleuze occurs within the context of a discussion of structuralism. Similarly, Derrida says in his 1968 essay, The Ends of Man, that the recent attention given to system and structure in France is a question of determining the possibility of sense on the basis of a formal organization which in itself has no sense, which does not mean that it is either the nonsense or the anguishing absurdity which haunts metaphysical humanism. Finally, Foucault, in his 1970 Les Odeurs du Discours, after rejecting the name structuralism for his own work, asks, if philosophy is in repeated contact with non-philosophy, where then lies the beginning of philosophy? Is it already there, secretly present, in that which is not philosophy, beginning to formulate itself half under its breath, amid the murmuring of things? But perhaps from that point on, philosophy has no raison d'être. Or maybe philosophy must begin on a foundation that is simultaneously arbitrary and absolute. We thus see the theme of the foundation of philosophical discourse and the theme of its formal structure substituting itself for the Hegelian theme of the movement proper to immediacy. Foucault claims that Hyppolite brought about this substitution, this new thought of nonsense, of non-philosophy, of the other. What makes Logic and Existence one of the great works of our time is Hyppolite's constant attempt to circumscribe the originality of Hegel's thought, an originality which lies in the relation of thought to the unthinkable. Hyppolite says, some have reproached Hegel for having spoken of a weakness of nature, for having shown the resistance of the brute existence to the logos. It seems to us, on the contrary, that this reproach brings to light the originality of his thought. Hegel does not construct the world with the pseudo-concepts of the academy. He takes seriously the pain, the work, and the patience of the negative. His concept is not the rational in the ordinary sense of the term, but the enlargement of thought, of reason which turns out to be capable of sublating itself as mere thought, as mere understanding, and to be capable of continuing to think itself in the beyond of mere abstract thought. Across spirit, the logos thinks itself and its other. Again, Hegel's originality lies in the rejection of this merely human explanation of negation, an explanation that we can find, for example, in Bergson, as well as in the rejection of the particular privilege granted to the thought that would nevertheless maintain that being, the thing, is in a sense always positive. Finally, Hegel's originality lies in the rejection of this calling forth by the end. Dialectical evolution is attraction and instinct. It starts from immediate being and returns to immediate being. It is truth only as engendered truth. On the other hand, it is indeed also dualistic, but this dualism is not, as in Spinoza, the parallelism of logos and nature, which never encounter one another. It is the dualism of mediation. Nature and logos are simultaneously opposite and identical. This is why the logos can think itself and the other, contradict itself in itself, and nature, which is the anti-logos, can appear as logos. By means of its precise examination of Hegel's logic, Logic and Existence, therefore, started what has to be seen as the attempt by French philosophers to escape from Hegel. As Foucault says, but truly to escape Hegel involves an exact appreciation of the price we have to pay to detach ourselves from him. It assumes that we are aware of the extent to which Hegel, insidiously perhaps, is close to us. It implies a knowledge in that which permits us to think against Hegel, of that which remains Hegelian. We have to determine the extent to which our anti-Hegelianism is possibly one of his tricks directed against us, at the end of which he stands motionless waiting for us. If, then, more than one of us is indebted to Jean Hyppolite, it is because he has tirelessly explored for us, and ahead of us, the path along which we may escape from Hegel. If the task of philosophy remains today one of becoming the philosophy of non-philosophy, or perhaps the non-philosophy of philosophy itself, then just as before, Logic and Existence remains an unavoidable text to read. Part 1, Language and Logic. Introduction. Hegelian logic starts with an identification of thought and the thing thought. The thing, being, is not beyond thought, and thought is not a subjective reflection that would be alien to being. This speculative logic extends Kant's transcendental logic by exercising the phantom of a thing in itself, which would always haunt our reflection and would limit knowledge in favor of faith and non-knowledge. Absolute knowledge means the in principle elimination of this non-knowledge, that is, the elimination of a transcendence essentially irreducible to our knowledge. By means of a recollection of human experience, the phenomenology of spirit demonstrates concretely that knowledge and the absolute coincide. Undoubtedly, in order to actualize such a demonstration, it is necessary to investigate thoroughly the notion of knowledge and that of absolute being, to show concretely, that is, by means of a description of experience, the nearly naive error which turns knowledge and concepts into an intermediate medium or an instrument. The denunciation of this error, however, is not made by means of scholastic arguments. It is made rather by a return to the things themselves, by an authentic naivete which disperses false interpretations and is satisfied with recording their necessary birth. Absolute knowledge is not different from the immediate knowledge with which the phenomenology of spirit starts. It is only its true comprehension. La vraie prise de conscience. Empiricism and rationalism are not opposed to one another. The dialectical invention is nothing but a discovery of being. It is not a more or less arbitrary construction. Moreover, the dialectical demonstration is intimately united to the reality that interprets itself and reflects itself in a meaningful language. On this point, the preface of the Phenomenology of Spirit, perhaps the best statement of Hegelian philosophy, provides pointers as dense as they are significant. The proper object of philosophy, Hegel says, is actuality, Wirklichkeit, the category of the logic which designates the concrete unity of essence and appearance, the presentation which presents only itself and tests its necessity, not in a separate intelligibility, but in its own movement and development. Actuality, understanding itself and expressing itself as human language, is what Hegel calls the concept or sense already immanent to the being of absolute knowledge. The being, according to Hegel, which, quote, is reflection, which is itself simple and which is for itself immediacy as such, being that is reflected into itself. Human language, the logos, is this reflection of being into itself, which always leads back to being, which always closes back on itself indefinitely, without ever positing or postulating a transcendence distinct from this internal reflection, without ever positing a beyond which would not be reflected completely, or a reflection which, although mediating, would be alongside being. Perhaps Hegel's ultimate project is the complete fusion of immediacy and mediation, of actuality and sense, a complete fusion which leads to a lived evidence, to a demonstration which is only the very movement of actuality, for mediation is nothing other than the movement of self-similarity. Philosophy does not concern itself with extrinsic demonstrations, as those of mathematics are for Hegel extrinsic demonstrations in which mediation, as an intermediate between inert unities, has to be composed and decomposed from the outside. Instead, philosophy concerns itself with demonstrations in which immediacy shows itself as self-mediation and as the mediation that proves to be genuine immediacy, the being which is sense and the sense which is being, by means of a reflection which is simultaneously a development and a return into the self. The abstract, or what is deprived of actuality, is not the element and content of philosophy, but rather it is the real element, what posits itself, what lives in itself, Dasein which exists in its own concept. Appearance, Erscheinung, is the movement of birth and death, the movement which itself neither is born nor dies, but which exists in itself and constitutes actuality in the movement of the life of truth. Philosophy's element is the temporality, which is eternal, that is, the perpetual movement of appearance, manifestation, which implies the exchange of the future and the past, of sense and being, and exists as the present permanence of this exchange, which is internal reflection. It seems then that the highest form of human experience, and there is nothing outside human experience, is the revelation of the identity of being and knowledge. The highest form of human experience is the penetration into the structure of this universal self-consciousness, at the heart of which being says itself, expresses itself, stating the thing of which one speaks as well as the I who speaks. To follow in this way the movement of the category diversifying itself into categories, into moments or particular nodes of a dialectical chain, is to turn philosophy into a logic, and such is really the sense of the Hegelian endeavor. This discourse that the philosopher forges about being, however, is as well the very discourse of being across the philosopher. This claim first presupposes that a philosophy, scattered throughout Hegel's texts of human language, be made explicit. Quote, the forms of thought find their exposition and their being in human language. In all that becomes its interiority, its representation in general, we rediscover the intervention of language, and in this language, we discover the categories. Thus man thinks quite naturally according to the logic, or rather that logic constitutes his very nature. But how can human language be cette voix qui se connaît et sans n'être plus la voix des personnes? This voice that knows itself when it no longer sounds like the voice of anyone. Paul Valéry. How can being say itself in man, and man become universal consciousness of being through language? In order to attempt to respond to this primordial question, one has to exercise the phantom of non-knowledge as well as the phantom of an ineffable. One has to show how human language is constituted as the Dasein of spirit and the sense of being, and finally, thereby, one has to dispel the notion of a properly technical language, which would not be at once sense and language, but rather extrinsic calculation, external manipulation of signs. Why does one have to prefer the logoi to the mathemata as the living expression of being? This last part of the question allows us to see in human language the very medium of the dialectic. Chapter 1, The Ineffable. What are the limits of knowledge and of language? This is the problem of non-knowledge and of the ineffable. The phenomenology encounters it first on the empirical level as fatal ignorance, when Oedipus does not recognize his father in his offender and his mother in the queen that he marries. When in good conscience one acts as if one knows completely all the circumstances of an action. But this non-knowledge is relative. It does not imply necessarily an absolute non-knowledge, essentially escaping from the concept. The phenomenology's philosophical consciousness moves against such an ineffable. The strained effort of conception must allow this original truth to be expressed conceptually. This original truth about which Reinhold speaks, and in reference to which Hegel writes in his work on Fichte and Schelling that, if such a truth were presupposed, it would be necessary to begin and end philosophy by forging inconceivable concepts rather than renouncing thought. To renounce discourse, to renounce the instituted community of consciousnesses, or to give oneself up to feelings that are below language are all the same. Quote, since the man of common sense makes his appeal to feeling, to an oracle within his breast, he is finished and done with anyone who does not agree. He only has to explain that he has nothing more to say to anyone who does not find and feel the same in himself. In other words, he tramples underfoot the roots of humanity. For it is the nature of humanity to press onward to agreement with others. Human nature only really exists in an instituted community of consciousnesses. The anti-human, the merely animal, consists in staying within the sphere of feeling and being able to communicate only at that level. End quote. If it is true, however, that thought is a dialogue with another or with oneself, we can indeed wonder whether being lends itself to expression and whether it does not escape radically from the logos which claims to signify it. In ancient philosophy, the problem is posed at the very level of the sensible world. What is merely felt is always fleeing, is in fact inexpressible, and science would not be able to remain science if it consists merely in sensation alone. The Platonist had to overcome the doxa so that human language is not objectless. Sensible being as pure singularity or pleasure is ineffable. Let us assume that singular things and souls exist in themselves. We would be able neither to conceive them nor to name them, since conception and language move within the universal. All the determinations through which we think things and which correspond to names are general determinations. They establish a community and a continuity between things which do not correspond to this opinion, which is, moreover, common, according to which the singular alone exists, is the first genuine object of sense certainty, the certainty which believes itself to be immediate and which claims to apprehend on the far side of all knowledge and all sense an individual this or an incomparable this one. There would be therefore a this side of language which would be the immediate grasp of a being by nature ineffable. There is, however, also a far side, a beyond of language, and of conception, which appears as the object of a faith. The philosophies which Hegel studies in his Jena work, Faith and Knowledge, are for him philosophies of reflection which deny more or less knowledge in order to make room for faith. Here the expression of non-knowledge is entirely at home. Knowledge would not be able to overcome the structure of experience as it is considered by the understanding and which is already implicit reflection, but thanks to explicit reflection, knowledge discovers its own finitude. It is therefore only capable of negating itself and of allowing faith to overcome this knowledge. The absolute, then, is the object of a faith and not of a knowledge. The absolute is beyond reflection and all knowledge. Hegel shows how these philosophies of reflection retreat to the final subjectivity of knowledge and drive everything into the mystery of a beyond of knowledge, into the mystery of an ineffable absolute. Let us pause, however, at the analysis Hegel provides of Jacobi's philosophy, which he studies between the philosophies of Kant and Fichte. Jacobi's philosophy has often been considered a philosophy of feeling, but this means only that it claims to replace knowledge with an immediate apprehension of being, to which Jacobi gives the general name faith. Knowledge is only formal, it grasps no content. It understands propositions, and the only consistent philosophy is for Jacobi that of Spinoza, which moreover Hegel tells us Jacobi understands rather badly. But faith overcomes philosophy through the direct apprehension of an inconceivable content, of an unconditioned, the immediate, that it discovers in the finite as well as in the infinite. Thus Jacobi can write, quote, "We are all born into faith and must remain in faith. It is through faith that we know that we have a body and that outside of us other bodies and other sensible beings are present," end quote. In other words, faith here does not concern merely the eternal or God, but also finite beings themselves insofar as their existences, and in a formula which has a contemporary ring to it, Jacobi can write, quote, doesn't the greatest attainment of an investigator lie in the unveiling and presentation of existence, end quote. But this attainment, according to Jacobi, can be acquired only by separating it from the rational form of science which is incapable of this unveiling. The inconceivable, the unnameable is the singular being in its pure singularity, the existent. It is also the beyond of these finite beings, the transcendent in the mutual relation of these two existents. Hegel tried to express Jacobi's worldview. Quote, "Now this relation of an absolute finitude to the truly absolute is faith. In faith, finitude does not recognize itself to be finitude and nothingness before the eternal, yet it manages this recognition in such a way that it saves and preserves itself as a being in itself outside of the absolute," end quote. Certainly Hegel recognizes that Jacobi is trying to maintain a singular vitality in moral life by asserting that, quote, "the law is made for man and not man for the law," end quote. But this vitality is buried in pure subjectivity in the unsayable singular soul. And the heroes of Jacobi's novels, the Allwills and the Voldemars, are always tormented by themselves. They do not give themselves up to objectivity. These are beautiful souls, certainly capable of moral beauty, but incapable of forgetting themselves, of renouncing this consciousness of subjectivity, of renouncing this perpetual return of reflection upon the subject who acts. The fundamental character of these figures is conscious lack of objectivity, this subjectivity which is always attached to itself, the unhealthy moral character. Nostalgic suffering is the lot of beautiful souls if, as the great poets, a Dante or a Goethe have noted, hell is to be always self-aware, to reflect constantly on one's own action. By developing the theme of Jacobi a little and this conception of faith that is opposed to knowledge, we would bring to light a primary silence before all language, a primary adherence to being which would be immediate and which knowledge, understood as reflection and concept, would disturb. This reflection, however, being capable of self-critique, of self-reflection, would discover in its own nothingness, and through faith, this reflection, however, being capable of self-critique, of self-reflection, would discover its own nothingness, and through faith would try to get back to the primary silence, the immediate contact with being. Philosophy, the expression of being in concepts or in discourse, would destroy itself. Silence, the ineffable, would be higher than speech. Like faith, non-knowledge would be the only possibility for man to overcome finite and conditioned knowledge, to overcome the knowledge which is stated in the mediation of discourse. If non-knowledge, the inconceivable, the ineffable, is an absolute limit of knowledge, then there is no absolute knowledge. Now, the phenomenology's essential thesis is the establishment of absolute knowledge on the basis of the whole of human experience. Knowledge, however, is not only knowledge of being, it is also what makes the instituted community of consciousnesses possible. As the phenomenology says, the Dasein of the pure self as self. Language says things, but it also says the I, le moi, who speaks, and it establishes communications among the diverse eyes. It is the universal instrument of mutual recognition. In language, self-consciousness, Qua singularity, being for itself comes as such into existence so that it exists for others. In language, Hegel concludes, we can say that the I is this particular I, but equally the universal I. If preparing for absolute knowledge, the phenomenology's task is really double. If it is proposing simultaneously to show that being life is knowledge, and that self-knowledge is universal knowledge, that is, that universal knowledge sublates and absorbs all the consciousnesses of singular selves, it has to be the case that self-consciousness not be an ineffable singularity enclosed in its own intuition. It has to be the case that human discourse be simultaneously the discourse of being and the discourse of a universal self-consciousness. That implies the possibility of a universal recognition, of an intelligible discourse which is simultaneously this I and all I's. Of course, the problem of recognition is not resolved immediately in Hegel's work. Violence is always possible, disdain or the haughty refusal to communicate, or even the feeling that one is unable to communicate at all. Barely having emerged from the pure self-feeling which defines animal existence, man faces a life and death battle, from which spring the masters and the slaves, from which spring the workers who transform the world, a battle that lasts until thought presents itself as universal thought, conceptual thought, but discourse reproduces in its own living dialectic the confrontation of self-consciousnesses. It reproduces the movement of mutual recognition, which is the very element of absolute knowledge. Originally, what does the word dialectic mean, if not the art of discussion and dialogue? Socrates starts from popular opinions and forces his interlocutor to come out of himself, to confront his thought with that of another, a confrontation from which oppositions and contradictions come. Often the interlocutor is led to discover a contradiction in his own thought. He can then flee from Socratic irony, refuse to continue the debate, or attempt to achieve harmony across the divergence of opinions. Thus, dialectic is the moment of discourse that elaborates the development of a universal self-consciousness, in which singularity is at the same time universal, and in which universality is at the same time singular. That is, a subject which expresses itself and is constituted from determination to determination. Every other singularity, that is, every I who takes refuge in silence and rejects communication, even claiming thereby to reach an absolute, on this side of or beyond expression, is the dupe of an illusion. Expression of sense is the work of thought, and this work does not start from an ineffable, which would be given first, nor does it lead beyond to an ineffable transcendence. Sensible singularity, as well as the mystery of faith, are for Hegel illusions, or rather, since he could not allow unexplained illusions, sensible singularity and the mystery of faith are the presentation of the absolute as pure nothingness or dissolution. Human life is always language, sense, without which human life loses its character and returns to animal life, and the singularity with which it thinks it has merged gets lost immediately in universality. But this is abstract universality, no less immediately. Immediate being turns back into nothingness. Only the becoming, which at the level of immediacy is already mediation, prefigures what this discourse will be, the reflection of being into itself, the absolute as universal self-consciousness or as subject positing itself, while at the starting point it was only presupposed, an empty name. Quote, apart from the self that is sensuously intuited or represented, it is above all the name, as name, that designates the pure subject, that is, hypokaimenon, substance, the empty unit without concept, end quote. But yet again, what is this sensuously intuited or represented self? What is this sensible outside of the sense with which language endows it? On this point, the phenomenology of spirit contains analyses which will be taken up again on the ontological level of the logic, and which can help elucidate already the famous reversal of being into nothingness with which this logic begins. The refutation of the ineffable and the proper character of human language as the logos of being and universal self-consciousness can be found again at several stages of the phenomenology of spirit, from the first chapter on sense certainty up to one of the last, in which the beautiful soul, rejecting universal recognition, sinks into nothingness, the sole expression of its failure. Of course, this development of self-consciousness seems able to be interrupted at each particular phase. It can get lost in violence. Socrates died as the victim of such violence, or it can be engulfed in boredom and dissolution. Dialectical discourse could therefore be interrupted, and skepticism is in effect always possible. What characterizes, however, this skepticism is that it always ends up as nothingness, and that in turn it always has need of a new content in order to be able to dissolve it. This nothingness is nothing other than what is presented in living nature as death, and as pure and simple disappearance in nature in general. The consciousness which claims to live in pure singularity without thinking it or signifying it can in fact only be dissolved. In vain it rejects language and discourse and claims to reach an ineffable absolute. What it says is the opposite of what it intends, and it is language which is right. Or if it stubbornly renounces language, this consciousness can only get lost, dissolved. Let us repeat, this dissolution is always possible, and then the only virtual transcendence seems to be that of nothingness. Skepticism does not see that the discursive process is always being pursued, going from form to form, from figure to figure, from determination to determination, and that every nothingness is, in a way, determinate, the nothingness of that from which it results. Skepticism itself finishes with the abstraction of nothingness. It isolates this nothingness as the ineffable instead of thinking it as the internal negativity which allows discourse to follow its course by going from determination to determination. The consciousness, however, which claims to reach absolute being in singularity, either outside of itself or in itself, is the victim of this claimed immediacy of being, and what it discovers instead of being is precisely nothingness, the transcendence of supreme abstraction instead of the sole concrete mediation. This passage from being to nothingness is the truth of immediate sense certainty which, rejecting mediation, is then prey to becoming. Sense certainty is consistent again only by accepting the determinations which establish the connection and community of all things, the connection and community which alone turn sensible singularity into an intersection of determinations. This possibility of dissolution, which is found in almost every phase of the phenomenology, in no way implies that the development of self-consciousness goes from nothingness to concrete and determinate being. Dissolution is not the reverse of progression, for self-consciousness progresses in its discourse from one determinate figure to another, from one sense to another, and not from nonsense to sense. Dissolution, either as investigation of pure immediacy or as rejection of all communication, which amounts to the same thing, is only that which haunts all the particular figures of consciousness, and this dissolution, this nonsense, is then the truth of the rejection of mediation. In sense certainty, consciousness tests its first relation to being. It is immediate certainty and claims to be certainty of immediacy. What it intends, therefore, is singular, unique, and ineffable being. The being outside of itself, this night or this unique light itself, this incomparable consciousness. But what it intends, that about which it has an opinion, in the sense of the Greek doxa, it really is unable to say. When science is faced with the demand, as if it were an acid test that it could not pass, that it should deduce, construct, find a priori, or however it is put, something called this thing, or this one man, it is reasonable that the demand should say which this thing, or which this particular man is meant, but it is impossible to say this. Phenomenology of Spirit. Now Hegel, who here could take sides against language, adopts this very language as what alone has validity. He says, speech has the divine nature of directly reversing the sense of what is said, of making it into something else. In other words, we do not absolutely say what in this sense certainty we mean to say, but language, as we see, is the more truthful. We really believe that we grasp singular immediate being as singular, but what we say is that there is something more universal, a this one. But everything is a this, every I is a this one. We believe that we grasp what is richest, but what remains of this experience for us is only the consciousness of our poverty. We see the singular transforming itself into the universal, and unique being passing into nothingness as the nothingness of all determinations. Of course, we can place these determinations back into their connections, and find then again being as determinate. But we are entering into the discourse which starts with the gesture through which we designate things, and if the universal is particularized, or is more and more closely determined, we nevertheless always remain within the universal, without ever being able to say anything other than the universal. Thus the categories already sustain all of what we call sensible perception, insofar as this perception is lived by a consciousness. These elements are the cohesive power and mastery of the understanding. They alone are what constitute what the sensible is as essence for consciousness, what determines the relations of consciousness with the sensible, and that in which the movement of perception and its truth runs its course. The understanding, however, which constitutes only perception or immediate sense certainty, is unaware of this character of perception or of certainty. Perception and sense certainty say that philosophy merely has to do with things of thought. As a matter of fact, philosophy does have to do with them too, recognizing them as pure essences, the absolute elements and powers, but in doing so, recognizes them in their specific determinateness as well, and is therefore the master over them. Immediate certainty and perception are already a sense which does not yet reflect on itself, a discourse which is not yet the discourse which recognizes itself as such, as self and as the discourse of things. Sensible consciousness does not, therefore, reach what it believes it reaches, or at least what it only intends. It is not, moreover, able to reach itself as a singular and unique soul. From the phenomenology's first pages, solipsism is refuted. However, is it not the case that for myself, I, certainty's subject, am an immediate evidence prior to all reflection? I exist, and I exist as unique and incomparable. It is I who sense, and to feel, sentir, is immediate only in me. But when I say, I, this one, I say, in fact, all the I's. When I say, I, this singular I say, in general, all I's. Everyone is what I say, everyone is I, this singular I. The illusion, however, is tenacious. Certainty's subject seems to have for itself a privilege. It believes that it takes hold of an invisible intuition of its being, which is below language, but all the other I's claim to have the same intuition. Their confrontation makes the claimed immediacy of their viewpoint disappear. Man, said Socrates, you are him, and me also. This I, originary and original, is in its ground only a universal, since language states it. It is not unique insofar as it says I. It only believes itself to be unique. This unicity is an opinion. The I who intends itself as unique is really more of a one, who constitutes the abstract medium of experience, just as abstract being constituted the medium of the felt. Here, the lived sublates language only in intention and not in fact. The I is merely universal, like now, here, or this in general, and this universal that language states is the poorest form of thought. It is the supreme abstraction, the implicit nothingness of determinations, the being which exists as abstraction but as self-abstraction, not as psychological abstraction. That I am unique and incomparable means as well that I am nothing, and then it means to be anything whatsoever. As this singular, I am the abstract universal, that is, having already in itself implicitly the moment of mediation as negation. A simple thing of this kind, which is through negation, which is neither this or that, a not this, and is with equal indifference this as well as that, such a thing we call universal. So it is in fact the universal that is the truth of sense certainty. Thus, sensible singularity expresses itself truly through its own annihilation. It passes away, it becomes, it negates itself. And if we want to retain it, it remains only as this abstract universal, the being identical to nothingness, this medium of all the determinations. The singular I also passes away. What remains is this universal name, I, that language states so exactly by transforming this claimed unicity into something banal. Hegel's analysis in the Phenomenology's first pages is decisive for the interpretation of his philosophy, including mediation under the form of universal negation or of nothingness. This universal is the being which is becoming, but which, removing itself from this movement of mediation, retains only the two identical poles. Being, which immediately posited in its rigid immediacy negates itself, in effect it becomes, and nothingness, which immediately posited in this same immediacy negates itself as well. That is, nothingness is, for being is always there, even in becoming. Far from excluding mediation, the genuine I, authentic singularity, that is, self-consciousness, instead coincides with mediation. It is true becoming, that is, self-becoming. Hegel says, the I, or becoming in general, the act of actualizing mediation is, by means of its simplicity, just the immediacy which becomes, as well as immediacy itself. Immediate singularity, which would be ineffable intuition, the what we will never see twice, is therefore the worst of banalities. If we posit it, we see it dissolve immediately. Fundamentally, it is dissolution. If this dissolution is understood, if it is sense and discourse, it is genesis as well as annihilation. It is mediation. This is why death is the beginning of the life of spirit, because at the level of nature the absolute substance appears as life as well as death, and this cycle is endless. The singularity of sensible things and of mortal living beings, which are modes of the absolute, present this absolute in its annihilation. In nature, there is only a sketch of this true singularity, which is reflected mediation, therefore the logos as universal self-consciousness. Nature is only spirit for the spirit who knows it. Nature is in itself logos. It is not logos for itself. It is immediately the Dasein of the logos, but it is posited as such only by spirit. But organic nature has no history. It falls from its universal, from life, directly into the singleness of Dasein, and the moments of simple determinateness and the single organic life united in its actuality produce the process of becoming merely as a contingent movement, in which each is active in its own part and the whole is indeed preserved. But this activity is restricted, so far as itself is concerned, merely to its center, because the whole is not present in this center, and is not present in it, because here it is not qua whole for itself. Singularity as immediate being, that is, that which wants to be abstracted from all mediation, is therefore immediately its dissolution. This is so in nature and likewise for the consciousness that would claim to escape from the becoming of sense, from discourse, and from mediation. Rejecting thought, giving itself up to something it believes to be purely lived, this consciousness degenerates into life's unconsciousness. What it discovers is necessarily death, a death of all the instants, and a death that, ex hypothesi, it does not understand, a death which therefore, for this consciousness, is simultaneously necessity and enigma. This is the case because necessity, felt as such and not thought, is the pure enigma. Quote, for necessity, fate, and the like is just that about which we cannot say what it does, what its specific laws and positive content are, because it is the absolute pure concept itself viewed as being, a relation that is simple and empty, but also irresistible and imperturbable, whose work is merely the nothingness of individuality. Let us assume, therefore, that consciousness rejects the universal discourse that immediately reverses its opinion. Let us assume that consciousness tries to take refuge in what it believes to be a pure experience, in order to taste there the unique pleasure of its own singularity. It would like to live instead of think. Hegel describes this experience for us at a higher stage of the phenomenology. In fact, the issue is no longer the test of immediate certainty in its most naive form. Rather, the issue is a sort of conscious, and if we can call it deliberate, decision to turn back. He takes the episode of Faust and Gretchen as his example of such an experience. It is the issue of a consciousness, weary of the universality of knowledge and of the burden of mediation, that claims to turn back completely toward ineffable pleasure. This consciousness knows that all theory is gray and green, the golden tree of life. It despises the understanding in science, the supreme gifts of man. But then it is delivered up to the devil, and must return into the ground, zu Grund gehen. The expression zu Grund gehen must be taken literally. This ground is precisely consciousness's annihilation, an annihilation which it even refuses to be able to understand. Consciousness aspires to immediacy, like Faust and Gretchen. This nearly amounts to saying that this consciousness aspires to disappear without even knowing it. Like the singular consciousness which wants to live the ineffable and refuses to think, it desires only to take life, much as a ripe fruit is plucked, which readily offers itself to the hand which takes it. But instead of being thrown from dead theory into life itself, it rather rushes into death, into the dissolution of its own singularity. It cannot understand this dissolution, since ex hypothesi, it has refused to connect the true to discourse, has claimed to descend below mediation, which alone constitutes a self-consciousness as such. It is therefore indeed the prey of necessity and of destiny. At this higher level, this consciousness repeats the experience of the stuttering consciousness with which the phenomenology started. Sense certainty believed that it held on to the singular this, but possessed only abstract being able to say only, it is able to be present only at its abstract negation. It wanted to get to the bottom of this pure singularity, and it really discovers the ground of it, the dissolution which still says itself, but which says nothing other than necessity or death, the pure enigma. Feeling does not contain by itself the explicit sense of the event. Consciousness, therefore, through its experience in which it should have found its truth, has really become an enigma to itself. The consequences of its deeds are for it not the deeds themselves. It finds itself alienated from itself, without being able to say anything about itself or to understand itself. Already the word destiny, especially if we make reference to Hegel's early works, means more than necessity. Destiny is a beginning of comprehension accompanying the abstract movement of life. To have a destiny is already to penetrate the sense of necessity. It is not only to live, but also to live by elevating oneself to self-consciousness, by accepting mediation. The transition of its living being into a lifeless necessity therefore appears to it as an inversion which is not mediated by anything at all. The mediating agency would have to be that in which both sides would be one, where therefore consciousness recognized one moment in the other, its purpose and action in fate, and its fate in its purpose and action, that is, would recognize its own essence in this necessity. If we were not a little wary of being paradoxical, we could say, by being careful to take the word logic in its Hegelian sense, that, according to Hegel, human experience can be only logical. It is logical, even when it is unaware of being so. The pure lived, this return to nature, means precisely nothing, and consciousness is always sense, discourse. Like an absolute limit, the ineffable is nothingness. This turning back is present in the phenomenology not only on the level of pleasure, but also on the level of knowledge. The consciousness which knows goes back down to a pure empiricism. Consciousness, which in its very first reality is sense certainty and intention of the this, returns here to this from the whole course of its experience, and is again a knowledge of what is purely negative of itself, or of things of sense, i.e., of things which immediately and indifferently confront its being for self. Here, however, it is not an immediate natural consciousness. On the contrary, it has become such for itself. This return to empiricism is based on the comprehension of the nullity of all the other figures, on a merely negative proof. Let us return, therefore, to pure experience. But this pure and ineffable experience reveals itself once more as the supreme abstraction. It has been said that skepticism is the fruit that empiricism always brings forth again. Skepticism is at least the result of this turning back, which aims to find again a this side of discourse and to keep itself there. When self-consciousness is not the logos for itself, it is the prey of a logic, of which it is no longer anything but the victim. Dialectic in itself exerts force on self-consciousness when self-consciousness is not this dialectic for itself. In order to be valid, this discourse must be the discourse of a universal self-consciousness. It is such a discourse already insofar as it is language, insofar as it presupposes an established communication between singular consciousnesses who, in language, mutually recognize one another and aspire to this recognition. This recognition is the fundamental element of absolute knowledge, but language is itself this recognition, and this connection of the singular and the universal which defines for Hegel the concept of sense. If for Descartes, the mathematician cannot be an atheist without losing the guarantee of his demonstrations, for Hegel, truth finds its soil and ground in this communication of consciousnesses. The beautiful soul, which encloses itself in interior silence in order not to soil the purity of its soul, which imagines that it finds at the bottom of itself the divine absolute in its immediacy, can only dissolve into nothingness. In this transparent purity of its moments, an unhappy so-called beautiful soul, its light dies away within it, and it vanishes like a shapeless vapor that dissolves into thin air. It must accept the transformation of its thought into being. It must let itself be given substantiality and entrust itself to absolute difference. But then it presents itself in its particularity, in the tight node of its determinations. Its salvation, however, could not lie in this flight in the face of determination into an interior refuge where it believes it establishes a silent contact with divinity. This pure interior life is an illusion. It can neither renounce universality nor reject the determination which alone endows it with design. Such a rejection would lead it only to the dissolution which, as we have seen, always lies in wait for abstract singularity, abstract precisely by means of this rejection of determinations, and therefore revealing itself as identical to abstract universality. With less naivete, the beautiful soul accomplishes in itself the movement which immediate consciousness, believing itself unique on this side of discourse, accomplished. It ends up by coming apart into madness or by sinking into the immediacy of pure being or nothingness, the possibility for resolving opaque determinations into the transparency of the universal. To undo the node lies in linguistic communication, in accepting dialogue. What the traditional philosophy of a Descartes or a Malebranche expects from a silent relation between human consciousness and God, Hegel expects from the expressed communication of consciousnesses who institute universal self-consciousness, which is itself the discovery of being as universal self. This is where the importance of the mutual recognition of self-consciousness in the whole phenomenology comes from. This recognition finds its element in the very language which states dialectically the oppositions and the actual sublations. Language is the design of spirit. Silence before the other, like interior silence, only leads to dissolution. One has to confess one's action, one's particular way of being in the world, in order to conquer one's universality, in order to make it recognizable. One also really has to welcome into oneself the particular determination of the other in order to raise it to universality, in order to promote this concrete universality which is the genuine unity of the singular and the universal. Here genuine, véritable, means accepting the mediation of particular determinations and not oscillating indefinitely from abstract singular to abstract universal, which turns out to be identical by means of this rejection of mediation. Language states this universal mediation. I speak and I say events and things, and what I say is already no longer me. The I is this I and the universal I. What I say, however, insofar as I say it, insofar as it is an intelligible speech, transposes the opacity of determinations into the element of universality. Thus the absolute as sense and as logos appears across man, but not across the one who refuses to externalize his interior life in the design of discourse, who confronts the confession of the penitent with his own stiff-necked, unrepentant character, who mutely keeps himself to himself, and refuses to throw himself away for someone else. Perhaps we can see why in his early works Hegel, repeating Plato, calls love what he now calls the concept. Both are immediate mediation. The possibility of raising determinations to universality, the possibility of making the self that was lost in the determinations emerge, the possibility, however, of making it emerge as universal self, this possibility is the very possibility of absolute knowledge, the light of being as sense. It is I which remains identical with itself, and, in its complete externalization and opposite, possesses the certainty of itself. It is God manifested in the midst of those who know themselves in the form of pure knowledge. This God, however, or this absolute, is no longer a transcendence beyond this knowledge, the ineffable endpoint of a never-attained aspiration. This knowledge becomes absolute when it knows itself as such, that is, when it is no longer only a dialectical discourse of man on being or on man's destiny, but when it is a discourse of being, an absolute self-certainty, in what was revealing itself explicitly only as the other of knowledge, when it is a logic of philosophy and no longer only a phenomenology. Christian religion had the premonition of this universal self-consciousness, which finds itself as self-consciousness, as the ultimate sense of being, or rather as the dialectical identity of being and sense, when, according to a still sensible modality, but isn't everything given in human experience, it announces, divine nature is the same as human nature. And it is this unity which is given to intuition in revealed religion. This intuition is, however, still an alienation, a being alien to sense, or a sense which is not a sense of self. This is why Hegel can say, God or the Absolute is accessible only in pure speculative knowledge, and is only in this knowledge, and is this very knowledge. The Absolute, therefore, is this very knowledge as absolute knowledge, the very knowledge in which substance presents itself as subject, in which being presents itself completely as sense, and sense as being. That, however, does not mean that the Absolute disappears and we are left only with a humanism, as some say. In the phenomenology, Hegel does not say man, but self-consciousness. The modern interpreters, who have immediately translated this term by man, have somewhat falsified Hegel's thought. Hegel is still too Spinozistic for us to be able to speak of a pure humanism. A pure humanism culminates only in skeptical irony and platitude. Undoubtedly, the logos appears in the human knowledge that interprets and says itself, but here man is only the intersection of this knowledge and this sense. Man is consciousness and self-consciousness, while at the same time natural Dasein. But consciousness and self-consciousness are not man. They say being as sense in man. They are the very being that knows itself and says itself. Only in this way can we understand that Hegel's philosophy results at least as much in a speculative logic as in a philosophy of history. For Hegel, therefore, there is no ineffable that would be on this side of or beyond knowledge, no immediate singularity or transcendence. There is no ontological silence. Rather, dialectical discourse is a progressive conquest of sense. That does not mean that sense would be in principle prior to discourse which discovers it and creates it, and that we are obligated to use these two verbs simultaneously indicates the difficulty of the problem. Rather, sense develops itself in discourse itself. One does not go from a silent intuition to an expression, from an inexpressible to an expressed, any more than from nonsense to sense. The progress of thought, its development, is the very progress of expression. The opposition of intuition and language no longer makes sense if language does not form thought and thought language. But if the information of one by the other is common, the one is not an external translation of the other. Sense unfolds itself and determines itself without its being given previously in an ineffable form. Undoubtedly, this progress of expression is the result of an incessant battle thanks to which the universal turns itself into self-consciousness instead of falling back into nothingness. This battle, however, is the very progress of expression, its complete development. Then the universal content is said. And this speech is the speech which says this universal as well as the expression of the self, who emits it and who, lost in this universal, ends up by returning to itself. The individual raises himself to the universal, while universality is presented as a self. Such is already the work of the poet and his creation. Quote, Spirit is present in this individual as his universal, and as the power over him from which he suffers violence, as his pathos, by giving himself over, to which his self-consciousness loses its freedom. But that positive power of universality is subdued by the pure self of the individual, the negative power. This pure activity, conscious of its inalienable strength, wrestles with the shapeless essence. Becoming its master, it has made the pathos into its material and given itself its content, and this unity emerges as a work, universal spirit individualized and represented. End quote. Hegel adds, now the perfect element at the heart of which interiority is also completely exterior, just as exteriority is interior, is still once more language. How can language, however, human speech, be simultaneously that of which one speaks and the one who speaks? How can it realize within itself this unity of self and being? Chapter 2. Sense and Sensible. On est des hommes sans langage. Paul Valéry. In Kant's philosophy, the understanding and the sensibility constitute two different sources of knowledge. Sensible diversity seems to come from a beyond of knowledge, or from a thing in itself, while the understanding raises itself above the sensible through its concepts in order to determine the sensible universally and make it thinkable. Hegel describes the passage from the sensible to the understanding, unveils the immanence of the universal to nature. In this dialectic, the sensible becomes the logos, meaningful language, and the thought of the sensible does not remain interior and mute. It is there in language. Language is not only a system of signs alien to the signified, it is also the existing universe of sense, and this universe is the interiorization of the world as well as the exteriorization of the eye. Language is a double movement that must be understood in its unity. Nature reveals itself as logos in human language, and the spirit that appears only in a contingent way in the human face and form finds its perfect expression only in language. The mediation reconnecting nature and the logos is the sole absolute, since the terms cannot exist independently of this very mediation. This dialectic of the sensible and sense determines the proper status of human language in Hegel's philosophy of spirit. It also orders the development of his aesthetics and the organization of his system of the arts. Sense and sensible, Hegel's aesthetics insists upon the revelatory relation of these words. Sense is this wonderful word which is used in two opposite meanings. On the one hand, it means the organ of immediate apprehension, but on the other hand, we mean by it the sense, the significance, the thought, the universal underlying the thing. And so sense is connected on the one hand with the immediate external aspect of existence, and on the other hand with its inner essence. Now, a sensuous consideration does not cut the two sides apart at all. In one direction, it contains the opposite one too, and in sensuous immediate perception, it at the same time apprehends the essence and the concept. But since it carries these very determinations in a still unseparated unity, it does not bring the concept as such into consciousness, but stops at foreshadowing it. There are therefore intermediaries between the sensible and the signification, which is only present in language. The transition from one to the other presents itself in the dialectic of the arts as well as in that of spirit. But one must not let oneself be deceived by this expression, intermediary, since Hegel's philosophy is a philosophy of mediation. Signification, such that it appears in language, sense as the becoming of the concept in discourse, exist first in relation to the movement which seems to engender them. There is no sense before language, any more than there is an ineffable absolute, or any more than there would be dreams for the one who would never be awake. The arts which precede poetry in the ascending series of the fine arts, architecture, sculpture, painting, and music, give us the illusion of an ineffable, which would be sense without speech, and in relation to which we could say in a paradoxical form that speech is itself mute. Couldn't we prefer the image to speech as the carrier of sense? Poetry, however, appears as the endpoint of a movement which remolds the sensible in order to signify it. Poetry is the supreme art, preserving from the sensible only the sound that disappears as soon as it is emitted. Sublating the elaboration of the world of sounds in music, poetry is the originary light of the world, because it says and narrates the world. Poetry also says the I who narrates and who, first thrust into his narrative with epic poetry, reflects upon himself in lyric poetry, and who, with dramatic poetry, is placed within the frame of his world. But if poetry is the apex of art, it is also the sign of its decline. It is complete in the double sense of the term. The negation of the sensible is almost too complete, so that there is still art and already pure signification. Sense as sense, that is philosophy, shines through. What therefore is art, if there is no ineffable sense, no sense independent of language? We indeed know that a picture is in no way reducible to the discourse that people can make about it, but the difficulty is still greater, setting aside the discourse about the picture or the idle talk surrounding the thing itself. Although people think almost exclusively of this discourse about when they insist on the incommensurability of the plastic work of art and speech, it is still the case that the work of art does not say itself, does not produce meaningful speech. It does not speak, at least insofar as a work of art does not coincide with its subject and resides rather in the way the work handles its subject. If the whole movement of art ascends toward poetry so that on the whole the expression is indeed signification, it is still the case that the arts prior to poetry are not signification at their particular stages. However, the picture presents itself as sense before signification. It seems to evoke for us a signification that we cannot formulate. If it does not actually speak, it seems to want to speak. Undoubtedly, there is an appearance there, but art is this very appearance, and it remains appearance or it disappears as art. It presupposes the absolute reference without which the very notion of sense is inconceivable, the universe of the logos or of significations. Art, however, does not come back to this universe directly. Like nature, it is signification in itself, but it differs from nature in that it seems to be sense for itself. Art is simultaneously nature and the suggestion of signification. It mimes a sense without ever delivering it. Purposiveness without a purpose. It is a nature which immediately evokes signification, a signification that falls back into nature, an indefinite oscillation from one to the other. It suggests the essence in the appearance, but is reduced to this suggestion. It is deception, in a non-pejorative sense. Art, Hegel says, is an existence made out of appearances. Its truth is really the idea, as the dialectical genesis of poetry shows. But this truth is no longer appearance, no longer art. The artwork makes mediation appear. It simulates it, and it gives a character of completeness and perfection to this pure appearance. Isn't what Hegel calls the prophetic soul, these gestures or expressions through which a way of being in the world prior to speech and explicit sense seems to be unveiled, the same as this? Psychology has recourse to an unconscious, as if signification existed in some unknown place, even before these very gestures. But it would be more precise to speak of a sort of nature, a nature which disappears as such gradually, as we go on to signify it on purpose, as we go on to untie the knot of opaque determinations by clarifying them with the light of sense. This sense is one that has to be presupposed, a sense which then explicates retrospectively what was there as being. But would not every being be a lost sense? The movement that provides a nature exists then in this reconquest of sense and in this displacement of the origin. The prophetic soul, and every manner of being in the world which does not reflect on itself as a prophetic soul, exists only for others. Its expression becomes sense by means of actual interpretation. The real difficulty of these intermediaries, in the arts as well as in the prophetic soul, is due to the fact that we would like to engender the signification on the basis of nature by means of a series of imperceptible progressions, by means of an empirical history. We do not see that this would be to renounce the very conception of mediation, that is, the mutual position of one term by the other, each positing and presupposing the other. It is indeed this mediation which appears in the passage from the sensible to sense, from immediate intuition to thought signification, but it also appears in the reverse passage from thought to its own alienation, to its Dasein, language. These two movements coincide. The sensible interiorizes itself, turns itself into essence, being becoming logos, and the interiority which in itself is the nothingness of being, its disappearance, exists however immediately in the exteriority of language and in the exteriority of living speech. That of which one speaks and the one who speaks show themselves to be inseparable. Object and subject finally transcend themselves as such in the authentic language of being, in the Hegelian ontology. This language appears as the existence of the essence, and dialectical discourse appears as the becoming of sense. However, within natural language, how is this language, which is no longer that of anyone, which is being's universal self-consciousness, to be distinguished from human all-too-human language? In other words, how does the passage from the phenomenology to absolute knowledge work? This question is the Hegelian question par excellence, and the very purpose of this work lies in the attempt to pose this question by confronting Hegel's diverse attitudes concerning it. The dialectical genesis of language, such as we will examine it here, according to the philosophy of spirit, part 3 of the Encyclopedia, already points to this problem. The sensible itself interiorizes itself into thought, and thought exteriorizes itself into language. The thought of being and the thought of thought must be unified. In the phenomenology, Hegel defines genuine thought, the concept, as a thought which gives the consistency of being in itself objective value to the I, and gives the subjective value of consciousnesses for itself to the thing thought. Thus, by thinking itself, thought always thinks being, and by thinking being, it thinks itself. For to think does not mean to be an abstract I, but an I which has at the same time the value of being in itself, of having itself for an object, or of relating itself to an objective essence, in such a way that its value is the being for itself of the consciousness, for which it is. Hegel adds that the object of thought is no longer a representation but a concept, and that through its determination the concept is a being which nevertheless remains a thought by means of the movement of this determination in thought. Dialectical discourse, the becoming of the categories in which being and thought are identical, is there. These categories, however, have language and speech for their medium. They exist only in this language that simultaneously negates the sensible and preserves it, sublates it. At the level of the philosophy of spirit, this dialectic of language presents the originary identity of the sensible and the understanding. Kant indeed tried to present the synthetic intermediary between the universal I of recognition and the sensible diversity in a subjective deduction of the categories. Perhaps he saw in the imagination this common source of the understanding and the sensibility. After Fichte, Hegel did not hesitate to see in the Kantian imagination the seed of genuine reason as mediation, as the dialectical unity of the in itself and the for itself. Kant, however, sought only to make accessible to knowledge a being which in its foundation escaped from knowledge. Hegel is unaware of this absolute limit. Sensible diversity refers only to this universality of the intelligence that is immanent to it. It turns itself into signification in a Dasein, man, who does not only contemplate things and is affected by them, but who also determines them in the negativity of action. Man's Dasein is his action. The one who speaks is involved in that about which he speaks. He is determined and he determines. He himself is this passage and this pure mediation which is actually the unity of sense and being, the concept as time. This involvement of the one who speaks in that about which he speaks presents itself in the passage from epic poetry to tragedy. By means of narrating, he becomes an actor. The negativity of being is also his negativity. He plays the role of negativity at the heart of necessity or of destiny, which then becomes his destiny at the same time as it is universal destiny. Now, absolute knowledge is this universal destiny that says itself as a self identical to being, and includes within itself the one who speaks and that about which one speaks, their unity and their opposition, the unity of their unity and of their difference. As the phenomenology shows, absolute knowledge assumes also the man of action, because he is not only the given signification, necessity, but also engendered signification, self-signification. The absolute is subject. Footnote. It is important to recognize this negativity of action preserved in absolute knowledge. This negativity of preserved action nevertheless poses a formidable problem in Hegelianism. What is the relation between this negativity of action and the negativity of thought in the dialectic of the categories? Hegel believed that he surmounts this difference because the logos is more than itself. It is the dialectical identity of being and sense. End footnote. The sensible, therefore, turns into sense by negating itself as sensible. This negation, Außenbung, is its position as signification stated in the universality of the I. In intuition, the universal I appears to itself first as affected from the outside. It finds a particular being and apprehends it. But already this affection in its concrete particularity is a discernment grounded in heres and nows, which constitute the universal spatio-temporal horizon. The intuition of the being always sublates itself. It fixes itself thematically by paying attention, but its marginal sublation is the index of its still immediate universality. Space and time are the universal forms of intuition, are the I outside of itself. Memory is the essentialization of this immediate intuition that exists only through recognition. The spatio-temporal datum passes away and becomes. It no longer is there as soon as it is there. Like the night about which the phenomenology speaks. The I remembers. The interior of things is the pure knowledge of the I, which includes everything in its simple universality. This I is universal intelligence, the night of preservation. Pure memory is the interiorization, Erinnerung, of the world. It is not a divisible and spatial, localizable image. In vain we look for traces and fibers in the brain where it might be housed. This interiorization is, however, the undivided seed, the potential coming to free existence in its development, and yet, at the same time, collecting itself in its inwardness. Immediate Dasein, the found sensible, is negated, and this first negation allows imagination to have the datum available in its absence, and to evoke it as absence. It is no longer the thing itself which is there, but me, the one who remembers the thing, interiorizes it. I no longer see, I no longer hear the thing, but I have seen it, I have heard it. In this way, memory is like the interior of being, its return to the seed, its recollection. Memory raises the concrete determinations of intuition to the universality of pure knowledge. By negating the sensible, the I still preserves it as an echo. It imagines the absence. It refers itself to what is not there in what is there, to what is there in what is not there. The imagination is symbolic and indicates the sense. This is why this memory, which interiorizes the world, exists only through the other memory which externalizes the I. Erinnerung exists only through Gedächtnis. The interiorization of that about which one speaks exists only through the complete exteriority of the one who speaks. This exteriority, the open system of language and speech, is thought in itself. Gedächtnis equals Denken, the thought that turns itself into a thing, a sensible being, a sound, while the thing itself is negated, interiorized into thought. Language's memory, with all its complex articulation, is the identity of being and thought. To understand the intimate connection of these two memories, and their inseparability, which Bergson has not done in his Matter and Memory, because he starts from the opposition of intuitive sense and discourse, and because he believes that he has criticized all language by means of criticizing one specific language, is to understand thereby even the concrete identity of the immediate and the universal, to catch a glimpse already of the reason why the logic will be able to treat immediate being, the structure of the sensible, while remaining in the universe of significations. Hegel therefore insists with justification on the speculative importance of this exteriority of thought in language, and not only on its practical and pedagogical importance. Language is learned and lived. It is the being of thought. Through this objective memory, Gedächtnis, the existent sonorous language and signification are unified. Memory is in this manner the passage into the activity of thought, which no longer has a sense, i.e., its objectivity is no longer severed from the subjective, and its interiority does not need to go outside for its existence. To comprehend the position and sense of memory, and to understand its organic interconnection with thought, is one of the hardest points, and hitherto one quite unregarded in the theory of spirit. Memory qua memory is itself merely the external mode, or merely existential aspect of thought, and thus needs a complementary element. The passage from it to thought is, to our view, or implicitly, the identity of reason with its existential mode, an identity from which it follows that reason only exists in a subject and as the function of that subject. Thus active reason is thought. The memory interior to things exists only in and through this exteriority of narrative, or through the one who says the things themselves, and without knowing it still says himself, since he says the things as thoughts. The one who speaks has transposed all sensible diversity into the element of its universality. He knows, still without knowing it explicitly, that he recognizes himself in this knowledge. Intelligence is recognition, although he is heard and he hears himself. The epic poet, become universal consciousness, narrates his world, which is the world. His pathos is not the stupefying power of nature, but mnemosyne, awareness and a gradually developed interiority, the recollection through memory of the formerly immediate being. This recollection is the first universality, the primordial language, the epos. Imagination, therefore, raises itself from intuition to actual representation through the symbol and the sign in which the sensible transcends itself. Objective memory posits at the same time the identity of the sign and the signification. In the symbol, the present intuition and the absent symbolized content still have something in common. They resemble one another, just as onomatopoeias suggest what they designate, just as symbolic writing or hieroglyphs preserves fixed representative elements that are abstract, by means of an arbitrary slicing up of the sensible. Intelligence is still the prisoner of the external datum, and of an analysis in invariant notions, an analysis which is the opposite of the mutual relation of determinations, the opposite of the totality immanent to the particular determinations. Hegel says somewhere that natural language, the child of intelligence, actually makes possible the dialectical discourse in which conceptual determinations not only are characterized by their context, but also are apt to enrich their significations by means of the discourse which posits them and sublates them. The passage from the symbol to the sign, whose history we could follow in an anthropology, presents the dialectical negation of the sensible, of the pure datum affecting the eye in intuition. Already the enigma is more than the symbol. The pyramid has no relation to the dead pharaoh. It invites the imagination to sublate itself toward an unknown secret. But there is no particular secret. The Egyptian enigmas were enigmas for the Egyptians themselves. The sensible is not what it appears to be. By itself it negates itself, like the sounds of the voice, which are no longer there as soon as they are there, and which nevertheless extend themselves into one another. In the pure sign, however, in pronounced words or in written words, which are signs of signs, the sensible is reduced down to the minimum. It does not count for itself. The ideal is to speak without accent, and for the educated man reading is deaf and writing is mute. The sensible has no resemblance to the represented content. It signifies the content, but is not itself what it signifies. The sensible becomes the signified by means of language's creative memory, which, at first pure arbitrariness, fixes then this universe of language and gives to it the solid consistency of the being that is found and always taken up. In its pure state, the sign is first an immediate intuition which represents a content wholly other than what it is itself. In principle, this arbitrary arbitrariness is an essential moment. It must be the case that the sensible completely transcends itself as sensible, that intelligence finds itself in an exteriority which is completely its own, a being which, while remaining entirely being, is nevertheless its creation, an alienation of itself into itself. This is why the anthropological origin of language, the existence of onomatopoeias, for example, is not the essential problem for Hegel. With Hegel, the issue is not exactly that of a history. In contrast to the symbol, and even to the sensible suggestions of the enigma, in the sign as such, the proper content of intuition, which is a here-now, and the content of which it is the sign, in no way agree. Likewise, one will have to forget the sign's musicality in order to see or hear in it the signification alone. Insofar as intelligence becomes signifying intelligence, it raises itself above symbolic imagination. It masters the sensible, although it turns itself into being an exteriority. It posits absolutely as its own this intuition of the sign, and it posits itself in this intuition. It does not, however, exist elsewhere. It is this position. Language is not a translation. Memory exercises, therefore, a new negation upon the sensible sign as such. What it is itself disappears, is no longer heard or seen, and in its place we hear and see signification. In the sentence we hear and see the becoming of sense. Signification is there in the exteriority of language. For us, the signs are the significations themselves. Thus intelligence is rendered external to itself, objective. It has even sublated its arbitrary creation, since it finds itself in language and lives in it. Intelligence finds sense, interiority, the opposite of being, as a being, and it finds the being, the opposite of sense, as a signification. It is as if a natural thing were completely becoming signification in the life of sense, visible and audible sense, without any alien support. It was becoming the life of sense by yet remaining something natural, and by reflecting itself. The universal I, interiority, exists only in language. There is no interior sense, which subsequently would be expressed. In sensible intuition, the I finds determinations. In language, what is its own comes to be for it like something found. Language precedes the thought, of which it is nevertheless the expression. Or if you like, thought precedes itself in this immediacy. Language refers only to itself, sublates itself only in language. And it is in this sense that we can call it natural. Symbolic imagination is in relation to language what the dream is in relation to wakefulness. The world, nature, are no longer a realm of images which have no Dasein, but a realm of names. This realm of images is spirit dreaming, which concerns itself with a content which has no reality, no Dasein. Its wakefulness is the realm of names. Now alone do the images have a truth. The one who dreams cannot distinguish himself from the one who is awake, but the one who is awake can distinguish himself from the one who dreams. If in the sign's arbitrary creation the represented content seems to be something other than the intuition which represents it, this difference disappears in objective memory. Making its own, this connection which is the sign intelligence by this memory elevates the single synthesis to a universal, i.e., permanent synthesis, in which word and sense are for it objectively united, and renders the intuition, which the word originally is, a representation. The elevation from an arbitrary creation to a permanent system, which is the I itself, in its self-exteriority, indeed therefore sublates the intended difference between the signification and the name. We think things in words without having recourse to sensible images. The name is thus the thing, insofar as it exists and counts in the realm of the understanding. In the name, memory has and recognizes the thing, and with the thing, it has the name apart from intuition and image. Given the name lion, we neither need the actual vision of the animal, nor its image even. The name alone, if we understand it, is the simple and unimaged representation. We think in names.
Moreover, the name does not refer to the sensible, but the sensible refers to the name, to the universe of expressed and expressible significations. Through language, we say the true being of the thing. What is this? We respond by saying it's a lion, something wholly other than what is in the intuition. There is its true being, its essence. Through the name, the object, as being, is born a second time. Such is the creative power that spirit exercises. Adam gave a name to everything. Man speaks to things in the same way as he does to what is his own, and lives in a spiritual nature in his world, and such is the being of the object, being as sense. It is language which reveals this being as sense, on condition of understanding thereby the system that sublates itself, the discourse that anticipates logical thought. Footnote, Encyclopedia, The Philosophy of Spirit. It is this logical instinct which gives rise to grammar, end footnote. And that constantly enlarges the name concept, already an originary proposition, through its connections with other determinate concepts. In order to specify a signification, this discourse refers not to a sense which would be behind language, but to other significations, themselves expressed and expressible. Like universality, the I is immanent to the totality of discourse. The I subtends it, but without ever distinguishing itself from it, because the insufficiencies of language are as well insufficiencies of thought, and vice versa. As we have already said, words are then no longer external to one another. They are structured in a way that can be more or less contingent or necessary according to the nature of this language, but in philosophical dialectic, this language tends toward the unity of intuitive understanding and discursive understanding, toward the unity that is the soul of Hegelian logic. Language as life is thus the intellectual intuition which exists only through its discursive development, the dialectical structuring of all the determinations as moments of this unique intuition. This is why Hegel calls this universe of discourse the space of names. As the existent of the content in intelligence, the name is the exteriority of intelligence itself. The memory of the name is at the same time the alienation into which theoretical spirit posits itself outside of itself. Thus it is being, a space of names. There is a multiplicity of names, of multiple connections among them. The I is their universal being, their power, their connection. But this I, the one who speaks, finds itself only in and through language. It does not exist elsewhere as a true or universal singularity. To understand the name is to go from signification to signification. It is to transcend language with language. Intelligence in its entirety is in this system to which it has given birth, but outside of which it cannot find itself. We have seen that this language is the supreme moment of representation, the passage to thought. The texts of the encyclopedia show us then how this language, which is thought in itself, Gedächtnis, becomes thought for itself, how the thought of being which constitutes language becomes the thought of thought, without it being the case that this reflection on language itself emerges from language. The movement through which the sensible, across the symbol and the sign, raises itself to thought, is the same as that through which the universal I exteriorizes itself. It is there in language. This is why the alien content, that of which one speaks, has become a thought, that of the one who speaks. By thinking being, thought therefore thinks itself. Its discourse on being becomes a discourse on itself, a discourse on its discourse. In the name, intelligence knows the thing, but now it finds its universal in the double signification of the universal as such, and of the universal as immediate or as being, finds that it is the genuine universal, which is its own unity overlapping and including its other, being. Thus intelligence in itself knows for itself. In it the universal, its production, the thought, is the thing. It is the simple identity of the subjective and the objective. It knows that what is thought is, and that what is only is insofar as it is a thought. For itself, the thinking of intelligence is to have thoughts. These are its content and object. However, this identity of thought and reflection is at this level still only a formal identity. As the reflection of its identity, thought is opposed to its thoughts insofar as they are determinate, and attributes to them an alien source for the content. Hegelian logic, as ontology, will be concerned with sublating such a distinction. It is quite remarkable, however, to see reflection, the thought of thought, appear in the encyclopedia's dialectic in a form different from that in which it appears in the phenomenology of spirit. In fact, reflection, this passage from thought in itself to thought for itself, is considered in the encyclopedia as a necessary passage. After an opposition of reflection to the thought of the content, it will lead to the dialectical identity, which is the soil of the logic, which this philosophy of language prepares, to an identity which will show that reflection is the very reflection of being in thought, and as well that thought is the thought of being. In contrast, the phenomenology studies the anthropological conditions of this reflection. It starts from human properly subjective reflection in order to sublate it, in order to show that this phenomenology, this human itinerary, leads to absolute knowledge, to an ontological reflection, which the phenomenology presupposes. If we just stayed with the phenomenology by separating it from its conclusion as well as from its preface, we would remain at a humanism, at a philosophical anthropology, and the logic, the logos of being, which is of such importance to Hegel, should be incomprehensible. In the encyclopedia, where, moreover, the phenomenology is replaced as an introduction to absolute knowledge by a study of the diverse positions of thought in regard to objectivity, absolute knowledge is introduced directly. But Hegel does not disavow the phenomenology which he mentions in this study.
The two works correspond to one another. The one, the Phenomenology of Spirit, is a theory of experience which presents the content of experience as if its source was alien to knowledge, but which shows that this experience presupposes absolute knowledge. The phenomenology establishes the soil of absolute knowledge, the universal consciousness of being, on the basis of human experience and on the basis of the finitude of this experience. The other starts from universal self-consciousness, which is at the same time as it thinks, whose language is the identity of this being and this reflection. It no longer makes the distinction characteristic of experience, the distinction between truth and certainty. The concept, such as it appears in this dialectical discourse, is simultaneously truth and certainty, being and sense. It is immanent to this being which says itself. This is why it appears at the end of the logic not only as the being which is sense through the mediation of reflection, but also as the sense which is. But this mediating reflection is no longer an external or subjective reflection. It is the very reflection of being. In the phenomenology, with the figures of consciousness and in a concrete form, experience discovers the determinate moments which are found again in the logic's dialectical discourse. But this discourse is no longer a discourse on experience, tarnished with subjectivity, always reflecting on its own subjectivity, a still human discourse. It is the discourse which says universal being in itself and for itself. It is the absolute itself which says itself as universal self-consciousness. In the Phenomenology's preface and in the chapter on absolute knowledge, Hegel specifies this correspondence between the theory of experience and philosophical logic. Whereas in the phenomenology of spirit, each moment is the difference of knowledge and truth, and is the movement in which that difference is sublated. Science, on the other hand, does not contain this difference and the sublation of it. On the contrary, since the moment has the form of the concept, it unites the objective form of truth and of the knowing self in an immediate unity. The moment does not appear as this movement of passing back and forth from consciousness or representation into self-consciousness and conversely. On the contrary, its pure shape, freed from its appearance to consciousness, the pure concept and its onward movement depends solely on its pure determinateness. Conversely, to each abstract moment of science corresponds a shape of manifest spirit as such. Absolute knowledge is the immediate knowledge which is reflection into itself, the being which is universal self-consciousness as being. This is why it can appear to itself in a phenomenology when, starting from immediate knowledge, it becomes knowledge of the immediate and shatters the concept, the logos, into its internal moments, that of truth, of the in itself, and that of certainty, of the for itself. Science contains within itself this necessity of externalizing the form of the concept, and it contains the passage from the concept into consciousness. The spirit that knows itself turns into, as difference, certainty of immediacy. The logic, therefore, explains the phenomenology. Philosophy, says Hegel, must alienate itself. Experience and the logos are not opposed. The discourse of experience and the discourse of being, the a posteriori and the a priori, correspond to one another and mutually require one another. There would be no possible experience without the presupposition of absolute knowledge, but the path of experience points ahead to absolute knowledge. It is true that the historicity of this absolute knowledge poses at the very heart of Hegelianism new and perhaps unsolvable problems. This absolute knowledge is the intellectual intuition immanent to the dialectical discourse, which in language is the identity of determinate thoughts and of the thought which thinks itself in them, and thinks itself only by fixing itself at these determinate thoughts, by stopping at these determinations in order to penetrate them and see them become. In this discourse, being itself reflects itself and expounds itself as intelligible speech. This philosophical logic assumes, therefore, that the thought which is there in language is at the same time the thought, the discourse of the self in the discourse of being, and that this discourse of the self, this reflection, remains at the same time the discourse of being. If this unity is not realized, only a formal reflection that opposes itself to the content exists. Dogmatism, empiricism, skepticism are the diverse attitudes that Hegel describes and presents at different stages of the phenomenology. Sometimes thought strays into sensible experience as such, and it happens that it does not raise itself up out of this immediacy. At other times, it reflects on its own subjectivity and always raises itself up over that of which it speaks. Quote, formalistic thinking argues back and forth in thoughts that have no actuality. Argumentation is freedom from all content and a sense of vanity towards it. What is looked for here is the effort to give up this freedom, and instead of being the arbitrarily moving principle of the content, to sink this freedom in the content, letting it move spontaneously of its own nature, by the self as its own self, and then to contemplate this movement. This refusal to intrude into the immanent rhythm of the concept, either arbitrarily or with wisdom obtained from elsewhere, constitutes a restraint, which is itself an essential moment of the concept." End quote. Pure empiricism and formalism that is idle talk complete one another. The logic's dialectical discourse is neither the discourse of experience with its reflection which assumes the concrete relation of human self-consciousness, nor formal discourse about discourse, which is empty or which is the idle talk of conversation. It is the authentic unity of that of which one speaks and of the one who speaks, of being and of the self, the sense which appears only in the medium of intelligible language. We have tried to show, with Hegel, the strict unity of that of which one speaks and of the one who speaks, the dialectical transposition of the sensible into the I, and the exteriorization of the I. However, this unity is expressed in different ways in the phenomenology and in the logic. At the level of the phenomenology, there is a sort of debate between the one who speaks and the world of which he speaks, a debate with those to whom he speaks and who hear him as he hears himself. This debate constitutes the very dialectic of human experience. There is, however, a permanent ambiguity concerning the variable limit of the two terms. The one who speaks reduces that of which he speaks to his own human subjectivity, or he projects it into an in itself which turns out later to be in itself only for him. At the level of formalism and of idle talk, the one who speaks always withdraws from that of which he speaks. He attempts to save his subjectivity by withdrawing from all objective content. In relation to philosophical dialectic, this idle talk is inauthenticity itself. It is no longer the debate with the world or with others, and it is not the authentic language of being such as Hegel's logic tries to present it. This logic says being, a little like the epic poet saying the world in his primordial language, but it says being by replacing merely representational thought with the rigor of the concept. How does this language of the concept differ from two other fundamental languages, that of the poet and that of the mathematician? Chapter 3. Philosophical Dialectic, Poetry, and Mathematical Symbolism. To give a purer sense to the words of the tribe, Stéphane Mallarmé. In language, being says itself across man, but all language is not authentic. Beyond the language of experience and beyond inconsistent and subjective idle talk, philosophy must also be distinguished from poetry and mathematical symbolism. In order to avoid the one, it is always tempted to move closer to the other. The poet speaks the language of representation, which seems to be a middle term between the sensible and the concept. Poetry is the very birth of language, the elevation to thought. Representation mixes that of which one speaks with the one who speaks, the objective with the subjective. It is not genuine mediation, and this is why it occupies an ambiguous position. Like the symbol or the enigma, poetry refers to an alien in itself that shines through without appearing completely. It mixes particular being with universal sense. It does not conceive the genuine unity which will be, for Hegel, speculative unity. Poetry, however, is prior to the severe and divisive distinctions of the understanding. The poetical world is a world in which the abstract universal and the distinct particular are still not separated as they will be in the prose of the world, this prose which Cervantes' work depicts so well by opposing the understanding's cold, stripped world to Don Quixote's objectless imagination. The primordial unity of the universal and the particular, of the objective and the subjective, is felt and foreshadowed by the poet. He is nostalgic for it. Poetry, which encompasses literature in general for Hegel, the novel is for him the modern form of the epic, and what is novelistic is the survival of the poetic in the prose of the world, lives in the medium of language. And yet, like the prior arts whose truth poetry is, it seems to be also like a sort of dream in relation to the sense which would exist as such. Poetry's existence refers to this sense, but when this sense exists in turn as such, poetry stops existing. The dialectical discourse of the logic is no longer poetry, although it is closer to poetry than to the understanding's abstract discourse. The prose of the world, which claims to delimit very exactly an empirical truth and a subjective illusion, begins with the understanding. The empirical sciences are the work of the understanding, and history, which was at first poetry as memory, becomes an exact science, or at least claims to be one. While poetry tends to rediscover, reflectively, the primitive magic of language, the understanding smashes the concrete representation into its elements which are fixed and determinate. The poetic mixture and literary symbolism are dissolved. Language wants to be, then, the expression of a thought which has for its guarantee the subtle fixity of the I in each considered determination. The one who speaks guarantees the permanence of these determinations. He is himself this formal permanence, this abstract tautology of a content which holds in the particularity of its distinct determination. As always, empiricism and formalism are complementary. The understanding subsumes determinations under determinations, or coordinates them. The formal I ties all these determinations back together, the external order. But precisely thereby it remains alien, just as abstract unity remains alien to multiplicity. Characterized in this way, the understanding always distinguishes that of which it speaks, the content, from the one who speaks, the form. The understanding is finite because it refers to a content whose origin is transcendent, and because it surveys this content from above, either in order to constitute empirical sciences with it, or in order to talk idly about it, and thus to preserve the I in its sterility by always keeping the I outside of the content. In these two cases, poetic discourse and the discourse of the understanding, the philosopher, is in inauthenticity. The cause, however, of this inauthenticity must be sought in the very condition of man, simultaneously natural design and universal self-consciousness. This condition defines representation as the equivocal mixture of that of which one speaks and of the one who speaks. It defines as well the understanding as the divisive distinction between a diversified content and a form. The one who speaks in poetry is the universal destiny of which he speaks, as well as the man who narrates. Representation sublates man and falls back into man. It springs from its natural Dasein. Like the Pythian sayings, it expresses the primary unity or attempts to rediscover it. It is closer to immediate knowledge than to the understanding. In the Phenomenology, therefore, Hegel follows, before taking it up again in the lectures on aesthetics, the development of poetry from the epic up to comedy, passing through tragedy. In comedy, the mask is thrown away, and the universal falls back into man. This disappearance of all transcendence, however, results only in the platitude of the prose of the world, in which the man who becomes the center, but center as natural design, is seen as the prey of a new dialectic, a dialectic which does not amuse its victim, but amuses rather the one who happens to be the spectator of it. Certainly, ancient comedy was a happy consciousness, since it represented the return of everything universal into self-certainty. Connecting itself, however, to natural Dasein and wanting to confer on it an arbitrary fixity, this certainty is in turn comic for the spectator. Modern comedy is this very dialectic, that of the man who gives the seal of the absolute to the finite as such, to the loved woman, to property, to particular contracts, to health, and is powerlessly present at the dissolution of all of what he took as assured, a dissolution that is tragic for him, comic for the others. Such as it appears in absolute knowledge, speculative philosophy, too, will indeed be the disappearance of all transcendence, the return into self-certainty, but self-certainty as universal self, the self of the content and not the merely human self. With equal reason, it will be neither an anthropologism nor a humanism. It will be a philosophy of the absolute which exists as the logos only in language. It will think and say the genuine unity of the being of which one speaks, and of the one who speaks, of truth and of certainty, but after a sublation of the human, a sublation similar to the one in which the sensible sign passes away into signification. It will be a reduction of the human condition. The logic's dialectical discourse will be the very discourse of being, the phenomenology having shown the possibility of bracketing man as natural design. The discourse of the understanding is, on the one hand, a human discourse on being, since it grasps content as alien to the I, and since the formal I coincides in fact with the particular determinations of an empirical I. Abstract person and contingent individual are opposed only in appearance, because they coincide at the base, and because the one is merely the formal lining of the other. The understanding, however, is an essential moment, as Hegel indeed shows in the Phenomenology's preface. Philosophy would not be able to remain at poetry's primitive prophecies, at this primordial unity which resists dissociation. It must pass through the understanding's analysis. After having shown the defects of the understanding, the Phenomenology's preface praises its power, which is the very power of dividing and distinguishing. The understanding, however, which triumphs in mathematics, is a reflection external to the very thing of which it speaks. This is why its language becomes mathematical symbolism. Sense, which is the concept itself, is erased in favor of a calculus. Philosophical demonstration, dialectical discourse, is of a wholly other order. It is the movement of the demonstrated thing, and it does not function by means of rules applied to the content from outside. The I, the one who speaks, is not then fixed in each determination, or beyond all the determinations as a formal I. Rather, the I gives itself up to the life of the content whose self it becomes. Determinations stop being alien to the I, since it is immanent to them, and it itself stops being separate from these determinations. As in poetry's primordial language, the universal and the particular are gathered together, but this is no longer an ambiguous mixture, because each determination is posited for itself, with all the rigor of discursive understanding, and yet by being reflected into itself, the determination becomes. Reason states this mediation. Its sense is there. This is why Hegel considers the reduction of reason to a calculus a misunderstanding of the nature of the concept, just as every return to poetry or to literature seems to him the abandonment of conceptual rigor. The philosopher's dialectical discourse passes over these two abysses, poetry and mathematical manipulation. What is essential is the unity of the I and its determinations as mediation and as sense. Quote, "Thoughts become fluid when pure thinking, this inner immediacy, recognizes itself as a moment, or when the pure certainty of self abstracts from itself, not by leaving itself out or setting itself aside, but by giving up the fixity of its self-positing, by giving up not only the fixity of the pure concrete, which the I itself is in contrast with its differentiated content, but also the fixity of the differentiated moments which, posited in the element of pure thinking, share the unconditioned nature of the I. Through this movement, the pure thoughts become concepts, and are only now what they are in truth, self-movements, circles, spiritual essences, which is what their substance is." End quote. How can language become the medium of this dialectical discourse? It is prior to thought, in the precise sense that Hegel gives to this word. It is the supreme moment of representation, and this is why poetry precedes prose. Precedes the prose of the world as much as that of the understanding, but also it expresses the thought which is known or reflected only in it. In language, thought, insofar as it is signification, is there immediately. It exists as a thing. It finds itself outside of itself. This is why the logical dialectic will be a dialectic of being. It will say immediate being before it says essence, which is reflection, just as signification is reflection in relation to the sign. But reflection in its turn is. It is immediately as sense within the totality of discourse. As we have described it, language presents the passage from the sensible to the sense, which makes being say itself, which makes being be self-consciousness. However, this passage, as much as this reflection of thought in language, allows one to understand poetic discourse as well as the illusion of the understanding which believes itself able to create an adequate system of signs in order to resolve or dissolve problems. Language precedes and expresses thought. This contradiction is the source of poetry and the exaggerations of symbolic calculation whose development Hegel could only foresee and whose claim to replace conceptual sense he condemns in Leibniz. To say that language is prior to thought means that thought is not a pure sense which could exist somewhere else, outside of its expression, like an essence beyond appearance. Thought is only by already being there, only by preceding itself in this speech which refers to nature and to anthropology by means of its sonorous material. In this speech which precedes the understanding by means of its grammatical structure, sketching in a way, at times prolifically, at other times insufficiently, the understanding's forms. This speech, in which the sensible sign disappears so that we hear the signification, is still in its form submerged in the sensible, while in its depth it gathers together that of which one speaks and the one who speaks, without distinguishing them clearly. One of Hegel's disciples, Benedetto Croce, said that the first word was a poetic word, and turned language into intuition expression, the first aesthetic moment of theoretical activity. He thus developed certain aspects of the dialectical genesis of language that we have described. Poetry precedes philosophy, just as music in principle precedes poetry in the Hegelian system of the fine arts. Music, however, like all the arts, is pure appearance of signification. Poetry reveals this by saying something. In Orpheus's miracles, sounds and their movements were really sufficient to tame the wild animals that came to lie about him, but not the men who required the content of a more elevated doctrine. Still as a reminiscence, poetry preserves this musicality in the signification. In its content, poetry, primordial language, the epic, which one has to distinguish from a reflective poetry opposing itself to prose, makes no claim to the understanding's exactitude, truth. It naively mixes that of which one speaks with the one who speaks. It does not distinguish the real from the imaginary, the poetic narrative from the understanding. This distinction begins with the fable, or the comparison, which is indeed careful to put the signification, the spiritual sense, on one side, and the practical content, which serves as its example, on the other. The prose of the world is born, and with it this separation, instituted by the understanding, between an essential interior and an essential exterior. It is still the understanding which claims to delimit the fictive narrative and the true narrative. Poetry, then, exists for the philosopher as a nostalgia, an immediate language which evokes an authentic but lost language of being. Moreover, it was not naturally immediate in the signification because it assumed already the technical concern of expression as such, the elaboration of a discourse molded out of human memory.
Footnote, Hegel considers poetry to be pre-reflective. There is, however, a poetry that strives to reconstruct primordial language after reflection. End footnote. Hegel does not consider language to be exclusively poetic. In the representation, it already announces the understanding. Since it is existing signification, language appears as the negation of the sensible in the sign itself. It is really the signification itself that I hear in speech and that I see in writing. Language is progress. At the heart of representation is this disappearance of the sensible which manifests it. Onomatopoeias disappear. Grammar is simplified and becomes more general. A mass of trivial distinctions, which gives rise to direct symbolism, coalesce when the symbol becomes solely a sign. The same happens in written language. Hieroglyphs are merely primitives. The return to a symbolic writing, like Leibniz's dream of a universal characteristic, is not only utopian, but also absurd, according to Hegel, because the progress of thought continually changes the nature and the relation of the objects of thought. One would therefore constantly need new symbols corresponding to new discoveries and to new relations of thought. This universal characteristic, which would assume an empirical analysis of things, would always be lagging behind these advances. The illusion of the understanding, however, is tenacious. It pushes the negation of the sensible to the limit and takes into consideration only the expression of thought in language, as if signification could be an interiority without exteriority. It imagines then the pure creation of a system of signs, or rather of symbols, which would be better adapted than verbal language to the significations. It repairs language on the basis of a thought, isolable in principle, and claims thereby to eliminate all the equivocations and ambiguities of language and of speech, as if thought did not precede itself or did not presuppose itself in being. This presupposition appears to the understanding to be contradictory. In certain respects, it is in fact contradictory, and this is why language is speculative. The understanding, however, misunderstands the speculative. Its critique of language can be valuable only up to a certain point, beyond which the external and the internal being separated, thought, under the pretext of expressing itself adequately, ends up losing all sense and being reduced to a calculus which is an exterior manipulation of symbols. These symbols can indeed designate or signify something, but they are treated only as sensible elements, external and indifferent to one another. Thus, according to Hegel, this requirement of purity results in an external manipulation, in a blind thought, for which we could substitute a machine. This illusion, however, is sustained by the example of the rigorous demonstrations and the exact calculations of mathematics, demonstrations and calculations which make the philosopher jealous. A mathematical algorithm exists. Why couldn't philosophical thought imitate the rigor of mathematical demonstrations? Why couldn't logic present itself as a calculus with symbols similar to those found in algebra? In this way, it would avoid the equivocations of natural language. Hegel tries to make the distinction between mathematics and philosophy precise. Dialectic has nothing to do with mathematical demonstrations, and the authentic logic has nothing to do with algebraic calculations. Although Hegel could not foresee the development of formalism and contemporary logistics, or the importance of this formalism, which tends to envelop logic and mathematics in one single discipline, his premature critique remains valuable, at least against the claim of this formalism to replace verbal language for the purpose of stating philosophical problems. Hegelian logic is the opposite of this formalism. It looks for the sense of the very form. For Hegelian logic to treat the concept, the judgment, and reason, by replacing the words of language with symbols and by applying to these symbols operational rules from the outside, is to descend from the sense which is immanent to them to a prior domain. It is to return to immediate being. For Hegel, even mathematics is only the category of quantity which is expressed in nature by indifferent diversity. The logoi, however, are different from the mathemata. Philosophical dialectic is logos. It is the discourse to which sense is always immanent, a sense which is there, in an external way, in speech's being, and which expresses itself through the development of words into a discourse. Being, reflection, sense are three moments of language. To stay at language's immediate being is not to sublate the sensible in language itself, and to return to poetry, which is the premonition of sense in the immediate, but to attach oneself to reflection is to negate language's substantial element, which allows language to be a language of sense across reflection. Reflective understanding extends, therefore, the negation of the sensible already achieved in the verbal sign. Let us suppose, in fact, that the signification can be isolated from its sensible sign, that it stops being exterior. Language will appear then as a set of clothes covering a body. But just as clothes can disguise the body, the external form of language will be able to disguise thought. Language dresses up a thought which could receive another, more appropriate set of clothing. We could therefore separate a problem from the language in which it is stated. We could look for more adequate signs in order to formulate it. We could, in particular, avoid those variations of significations arising from context, that perpetual equivocation and ambiguity of the sense of words. The understanding would like a fixity and an exactitude that is not found in existing language. The idea of creating a pure language, a system of symbols which remain absolutely invariant over the course of the diverse combinations they undergo, comes from this. Perhaps philosophic problems would be posed differently, or would be dissolved, since they come from certain verbal confusions, from the shiftings of sense found so often in a discourse. A symbolic language would avoid these transformations of a word's signification by making itself the pure creator of its system of signs. The eye of the understanding would not find significations already there. It would not be engaged in them as one is already in life when alive. It could take the things up at their base and replace an explicit convention for what is present to it as already agreed upon, for what appears to it as an alienation of its own interiority. The words of language, however, are the I outside of itself, finding itself there before actually being there. The I continues to be in their mutual relation, in their past arrangement as in their present transformation. It embraces the language which seems to it to be an alienation of itself, and now makes it say what it had never said, with words that were existing in the past. Self-expression makes progress because, across the expressed content, what was there earlier, sense announces itself and states itself in a universal way. The self can never withdraw from this language, from this universal reference, which nevertheless, in its exteriority, remains reflection and sense. We read a philosopher, and we first take his words in their usual sense. Little by little, the context constrains us to make imperceptible changes, and the use he makes of context ends up affecting the words with a new signification proper to him, a signification proper to him but nevertheless universal since we understand it. Language, Hegel says, is the self existing as self, and it does not exist anywhere else than in language as singular self and universal self at the same time. When the understanding claims therefore to strip a problem of its language, it is already the dupe of an illusion. It inevitably leads us to ask this question: what would the problem be without the clothing of its language? There is, however, no naked problem when the issue is philosophical problems. It is impossible to pose Plato's problems differently without changing them radically, without posing different problems. The progress of thought is parallel to the progress of its expression. The one is strictly unified with the other. This is where the difficulty of a translation comes from, and translation is executed as a transposition in the very medium of universal language without passing through a naked sense. The necessity of following the genesis of sense in the very language in which it has been stated, in order to seek in another language what is approximately equivalent. What, therefore, is the word such that it is so indispensable to dialectical discourse, such that we cannot replace it with arbitrarily created symbols, while preserving the fixity of an invariant signification throughout the whole discourse? The word is the concrete universal, the Hegelian concept which is totality. This is why the word does not exist without the proposition whose seed it is, and why the proposition does not exist without the set of propositions which reconstitute this totality as a result. To say that the absolute is subject is to say that the concept word is what it is only in the predicates which confer on it its content, only in its relations. But this means as well that these relations constitute a totality, a sense which is a support and not a fixed and immobile being. Even when it is not yet explicitly intended as the philosophical dialectic, language indicates this dialectic. By considering the different ways in which one can understand the proposition and the relations of propositions among themselves, Hegel can characterize philosophical discourse in the Phenomenology's preface in relation to colloquial discourse or in relation to the understanding's discourse. The word, the verbal sign, is not at first arbitrary, despite the in-principle arbitrariness of the sign. The I finds the sign and takes possession of it as an immanent signification, which sublates what it seems to be in a singular consciousness. The word gold, Leibniz said already, is not only what supports the determinations that the common people attribute to it, but also what supports those that the educated discoverer.
The word expresses a universal harmony, which nevertheless is never constituted as such, which is already there. Like the sign, the word remains invariant, but its determinations become precise by means of the diverse relations which are established at the very heart of language. As such, a name is something which is identical in different contexts, but this identity is not a dead identity. It is not an identity of the understanding. The sign exists in the same way. The signification is modified by means of the context. This becoming is certainly the source of equivocations, and one can abandon oneself to it. When one is a poet, abandon oneself to the friendly similarities which shine out from among the words. But we can also seek the coherence of discourse, resist what seems easy, get hold of the determinations again. Such is the proper function of the understanding. This coherence, however, cannot be pushed to the limit. The understanding isolates a signification in the proposition which endows the word with its content, the content without which it would be a simple name, a flatus vocis. But the understanding sees this signification immediately asserted, enriching and transforming itself constantly. Although it is necessary to maintain unity and invariance, we maintain this invariance only as mediation, as total sense. This is why the word is the concrete universal and is already discourse, concept, judgment, reason. The immediate being of thought, reflection, mediation is present naively in colloquial discourse and in the empirical discourse where the word seems to receive its enrichment from the outside, while formal understanding avoids contradiction as much as it can by reconciling its formalism with the heterology of experience. Quote, just as when I say all animals, this expression cannot pass for a zoology, end quote. The word is the universal which still awaits its development, which will be what it is in truth only at the end of the development. In dialectical discourse, however, in the philosophical logic, the absolute displays itself as result, as mediation. Quote, the only transition to a proposition contains a becoming other which must be reassimilated, or is a mediation, end quote. Taken as logos, language is this totality, which is such only through discourse, in which thought, completely immanent to its development, posits itself as sense, stretched across the reflection of its determinations. This becoming of sense in the diversity of significations is a banal observation. Go over the list of senses of the word eidos, Bergson says, in the Aristotelian dictionary. You will see how much they differ. If we examine two of them, which are sufficiently distant from one another, they will seem nearly to exclude one another. They do not exclude one another because the chain of intermediary senses reconnects them. By making the necessary effort to embrace the whole, we notice that we are in the real and not before a mathematical essence that could be summed up in a simple formula. Bergson, however, would like to grasp this reality in an intuition, or express it through an image. An image is already a relapse into intuition, instead of apprehending it in discourse itself, in the development of the signification. For him, verbal language is already the beginning of mathematical symbolism. Verbal language is less pure, but it is also artificial, external to the growth of a thought, which could in principle be separated from language. It is the essence of science, Bergson writes again, to handle signs, which it substitutes for the objects themselves. These signs undoubtedly differ from those of language by their greater precision and their higher level of efficiency. They are nonetheless tied down to the general condition of the sign, which is to denote a fixed aspect of reality under a stable form. The creation of these signs by the understanding, or rather the creation of these symbols, for they were first symbols in the strict sense of the term, allows for the permanence, the absolute fixity, the exactitude, which is not found in natural language. But what is thereby gained occurs at the expense of the mobile signification, at the expense of sense. Language's sign is signification. It disappears as sensible sign. In contrast, the symbol had value by means of the sensible intuition which represented something. But then the understanding was working simultaneously on the signification and on the sensible. This is why Hegel considers symbolism, in this sense, like a turning back. Since man has in language a means of designation peculiar to reason, it is an idle fancy to search for a less perfect mode of representation to plague oneself with. If, however, one should seriously propose to employ symbols for expressing and knowing the concept,
then the external nature of all symbols is inadequate to the task. The truth about the relationship is rather the converse, namely that what in symbols is an echo of a higher determination is only truly known through the concept and can be approximated to the concept only by separating off the sensuous, unessential part that was meant to express it. To turn back from language to the symbol is to manipulate the sensible as such while believing oneself to be manipulating significations. And what is produced here is a sort of dialectical reversal. In order to create a more pure language, in order moreover to negate the sensible, the understanding ends up considering only the sensible and manipulating it as such. While in language the signification is there, while in the imagination's symbol, which Descartes, for example, uses when he represents all magnitudes by means of lines in the regulae, the signification is an interior. In symbolism pushed to its extreme limit, what the symbol represents is no longer important, is not taken into consideration. We indeed still speak of the symbol, but thought intends nothing. Thought considers the sign as an immobile, sensible content and no longer as a sign. The signification of the signs which figures in the axioms is not taken into account. We merely manipulate the content by virtue of pre-established rules without coordinating any sort of objects to them. It is a manipulation that presents itself as a tautology, the understanding always conserving the fixity and invariance of its content. The combinations brought about ex hypothesi, however, add nothing to those from which we started. The problem of signification is certainly posed at the beginning and at the end, but it is not posed in the middle. There is where the complete separation of the one who speaks from the determinate content of which he speaks takes place. This content is determinate and fixed because it is purely objective. The one who speaks performs only formal operations, operations which add nothing to the content, even though they posit it differently. Because the one who speaks is purely and completely subject, distinct from the object, acting from the exterior, without being at the same time the sense of that of which he speaks. The self, however, of which Hegel speaks in philosophic dialectic, is the very sense of the content. It inhabits the determinations. It is these determinations in their becoming. The issue could not be, for Hegel, to deny the importance of this symbolism, of this algebra of logic. He would not be able to deny the importance of what this algebra can do for the empirical sciences. He would not be able to deny the importance, perhaps even through the difficulties encountered, through the obstacles never completely surmounted in formalization, of the sense that philosophy can discover in this very formalization. By discovering the principle of this formalization, the issue is only to contest its possible application to philosophical discourse, which for Hegel is mediation and which, with the help of language, is always concept and sense. What is at issue is to critique the calculus that would claim to replace the investigation of sense that Hegel makes. Quote, the operations of arithmetic are an external combining or separation of numbers, a mechanical operation. Indeed, calculating machines have been invented which perform these operations, whereas it is the harshest and most glaring of contradictions when the form determinations of the syllogism, which are concepts, are treated as conceptless material, end quote. For Hegel, the operation of calculus is reduced to a purely external unification or separation. Leibniz, he says, makes much of the usefulness of the analysis of combinations for ascertaining not only the forms of the syllogism, but also the combinations of other concepts. The operation by which this is ascertained is the same as that by which it is calculated. How many throws are possible in a game of dice, etc. The rational is taken as a dead and conceptless thing, and the characteristic feature of the concept and its determinations as spiritual essences to relate themselves, and through this relating to sublate their immediate determination, is ignored. The critique that Hegel addresses to Leibniz's project of a universal characteristic indeed shows that for him determinations are a becoming, that they could not remain unchanged like a meaningless objective content. Quote, connected with this was a pet idea of Leibniz, the idea of a characteristica universalis of concepts, a language of symbols in which each concept would be represented as a relation proceeding from others or in relations to others, as though in the rational combination, which is essentially dialectical, a content still retained the same determinations that it possesses when fixed in isolation, end quote. Philosophical dialectic is not, therefore, for Hegel, reducible to a pan-logicism in the Leibnizian sense. It is a life already immanent to language, as such, where sense appears in the mediation. The ontological logic is the antithesis of a formalism. In immediate being, it discovers the thought of being, which is immanent to it.
and sees in reflection as well a moment which sublates itself, and is there immediately as sense. Being itself posits itself and says itself across discourse, and the forms of this discourse are to be considered in their sense and not to be isolated as formal rules exterior to their content. The thought of thought is speculatively the thought of being, just as the thought of being is a thought of thought. Hegel opposes this dialectical discourse to mathematics, the logoi to the mathemata. For him, as for Kant, mathematics concerns only the sensible world, insofar as this world is space in which it is all the same whether it increase or diminishes itself, concerns only the category of quantity, synthesis of indifferent differences. This conception of mathematics lets Hegel see an operation external to the thing itself, an alien reflection in mathematical demonstration. The thing itself is not demonstrated. The thing itself does not become what we assert about it. Reflection lets us see its properties by means of the constructions that it adds to the thing, and which are not found again in the naked result. Certainly, this result is seen as true, as necessary, but it does not contain its own genesis. Necessity is established through the subject who demonstrates. Necessity is therefore really there, but not the mediation itself, which remains in the subject. The process of the demonstration is a process of knowledge distinct from its object. It is not a movement of the object itself. This is why the dialectic interior to the thing itself is opposed to demonstration. Hegel revalorizes the logoi against the mathemata. The mathemata are only one moment of the logoi, the moment of the category of quantity in the logic of being, that is, the logic of immediacy. Footnote. It's a long one. The Hegelian conception of mathematics, science of magnitudes, and of quantity in general, again throws into relief the originality of the dialectic of the logic, which is an autonomous development of the idea, consciousness being lost in its object. Perhaps, however, the internal development of mathematics is not foreign to such a dialectic. Through a curious paradox, Jean Hyppolite speaks of this development of the mathemata in his work on logic and the theory of science, in nearly Hegelian terms. Opposing himself to a transcendental subjectivism that he attributes to Husserl, he writes, "If transcendental logic truly founds logic, there is no absolute logic, that is, governing the absolute subjective activity. If there is an absolute logic, it can draw its authority only from itself, and then it is not transcendental." He shows as well the limits of formalism in mathematics. The mathematical structure possesses an internal coherence which cannot be treated abruptly. Its progressive character is essential, and the decisions which neglect this lose themselves in the void. Finally, the tautological conception of mathematical systems is smashed to pieces. Only the theories smaller than arithmetic, that is, the theories which may be called quasi-finite, can be nomological. Their development is indeed of a combinatory order, and their domination through the sole consideration of axioms is truly effective, but genuine mathematics begins with the infinite. In contrast, Hegel does not grant to mathematics the comprehension of the infinite, a truly conceptual reflection, an infinite which escapes from mathematical determination. Savais speaks of a deductive structure, creator of the content that it attains. The possibility of assembling some privileged assertions at the outset is a source of illusion if we forget the operational rules which alone give them a meaning. As in Hegelian dialectic, there is therefore an internal progression from singular content to singular content. There is no consciousness which generates its products or is simply immanent to them. In each instance, it dwells in the immediacy of the idea, lost in it and losing itself with it, binding itself to other consciousnesses, which one would be tempted to call other moments of consciousness, only through the internal bonds of the ideas to which these belong. The progress is material or between singular essences, and its driving force is the need to surpass each of them. It is not a philosophy of consciousness, but a philosophy of the concept, which can provide a theory of science. The generating necessity is not the necessity of an activity, but the necessity of a dialectic. If a dialectic proper to mathematics exists in this way, where would it fit in a logic of being like that of Hegel? Perhaps, however, in Hegel, the self is more immanent to the content than in Savais. On this point, the rapprochement of Savais with Spinoza would be more precise than the rapprochement of Savais with Hegel. Savais makes us think less of the unity of subject and object resulting in sense than of God's infinite understanding in Spinoza and of the passage from true idea to true idea. It is important to consider, however, that we could describe the development of mathematics in dialectical terms, but the question would still concern the relation of this dialectic of mathemata, the intermediaries in Plato, with that of the logoi. Nevertheless, it is remarkable to note that Savias speaks of a dialectic of mathemata in such Hegelian terms. End footnote. Natural language appears therefore as the proper medium of philosophic discourse. In natural language, this absolute genesis will be able to be said. This can be done by sublating the purely poetical language that still belongs to representation, by maintaining the understanding's determinations and fixations, but as well by dissolving them, or rather by following their own internal dissolution, in a dialectic which engenders the totality of sense. This philosophical discourse indeed recognizes the understanding, but it also displays this understanding's contradictions and their own sublation. Thus the understanding is a becoming, and as this becoming, it is rationality. We could only say, finally, that this philosophical language preserves from the total poetic impulse the creative power and the immanence of the whole, and that from the understanding it preserves the weight and force which restrains the whole movement and stops it from dissipating one sole profound intention into a dispersed extension. Thus the intellectual intuition that is the logos is simultaneously this total impulse and the permanent weight which restrains and fixes the impulse by allowing it to be realized in a continuous progression. This is why it is also discourse. End of part 1.